Imagine you are young soldiers in 1944. In front of you is the coast of Normandy, behind you is the English Channel, and around you thousands of ships, planes and men are waiting for a single order. No one knows whether this huge landing will succeed. No one knows whether the German defenders will react in time. And no one knows whether this day will actually be the beginning of the end of the Second World War in Europe. Operation Overlord was not just a military action. It was a huge risk, a political necessity, and one of the biggest decisions of the entire war. On June 6, 1944, the Allied landings in Normandy began with D-Day. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops stormed the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Behind this attack were years of planning, secret deception, gigantic amounts of material, and a firm will to break Hitler's rule in Western Europe. But was Operation Overlord really the decisive turning point of the Second World War, or was Germany's defeat already inevitable at that time? Write your opinion in the comments below. Do you think D-Day decided the war, or was it above all the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe? I'm looking forward to your assessment. If you are interested in historical topics, major battles, political backgrounds, and the human fates behind the events, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. In this way, you support this format and don't miss any more episodes about the decisive moments in world history. 1. Europe's darkest hour and the idea of a return. When France collapsed in the summer of 1940, Europe's political and military order changed at a speed that even many contemporaries could hardly comprehend. Only a few weeks earlier, the French army had been considered one of the strongest armed forces in the world. Its border was protected by fortifications. Its generals looked back on the victory in the First World War, and many politicians in London and Paris believed that Germany would be exhausted economically and militarily in a long war. But the German offensive in the West destroyed these expectations. With rapid tank blasts, risky movements through the Ardennes, and close cooperation between the Luftwaffe and ground troops, the Wehrmacht managed to break through the Allied lines and push the British and French troops to the coast. The evacuation of Dunkirk saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but it was also a symbol of defeat. Britain had saved its army, but almost all the heavy equipment remained on the continent. With the Armistice of France in June 1940, Adolf Hitler was at the height of his power. Germany controlled large parts of Europe directly or indirectly. Poland was smashed, Denmark and Norway were occupied, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg were under German rule, and France was divided between occupied territories and the collaborating Vichy regime. For millions of people, this new order meant oppression, fear, persecution, and the loss of political freedom. For the German leadership, however, a dream seemed to come true. The continent was largely subjugated, the British Isles were isolated, and many in Berlin believed that Britain would sooner or later be forced to negotiate. But this is exactly where the story of Operation Overlord began in its deeper sense. It did not begin with a landing craft off Normandy, but with the question of whether Britain would continue to fight after the defeat of France. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister in May 1940, decided against any idea of a compromise peace with Hitler. It was clear to him that a Europe under German domination was not only a military threat, but also a moral and political catastrophe. His speeches gave the British people not the illusion of a quick victory, but the determination to persevere. He spoke of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and it was precisely this harshness that made his words credible. Britain was weakened, but not defeated. In the summer and autumn of 1940, Hitler tried to break the British resistance by means of air raids. The Battle of Britain became a decisive moment. The German Luftwaffe wanted to gain control of the airspace in preparation for a possible invasion of the British Isles or to force Britain to give in. But the Royal Air Force held out. Radar, well-organized air defense, determined pilots, and German miscalculations prevented the German victory. The planned invasion of England was postponed and finally abandoned. Britain thus retained as a military base, political refuge, and symbol of resistance. Without this island, there could have been no invasion of Normandy later on. Nevertheless, Britain alone was not strong enough to reconquer the continent. The British army had to be rebuilt, the economy was strained, and the war at sea threatened supplies. German submarines attacked merchant ships in the Atlantic and tried to cut Britain off from food, fuel, and American aid. The British strategy therefore had to remain defensive for the time being. They fought in North Africa, in the Mediterranean and in the air, supported resistance movements and relied on blockade, intelligence operations and perseverance. A direct return to France was still impossible at that time. But the idea remained. At some point, an army had to return across the English Channel if Europe was to be liberated. The war finally turned into a world war in 1941. In June, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of a war of annihilation of tremendous brutality. The German leadership not only wanted to win militarily, but also to conquer territories, subjugate populations, and realize ideological goals. The war in the East became the largest and bloodiest theater of the Second World War. Millions of soldiers and civilians died, cities were destroyed, prisoners starved to death, and the National Socialist policy of violence reached a new dimension. For Great Britain, the German attack on the Soviet Union initially meant relief, because Germany now had to tie up enormous forces in the East. At the same time, a difficult alliance was formed with Stalin, whose state was itself marked by repression and violence. But in the fight against Hitler, political differences were temporarily put on the back burner. Even more decisive was the entry of the United States into the war. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and the German declaration of war on the USA, Great Britain was no longer alone. America brought an industrial, economic, and military force to the war that was hard to beat in the long run. Factories produced planes, tanks, trucks, ships, and ammunition in huge quantities. Millions of American soldiers were trained, transported across the Atlantic, and prepared for war. But an invasion of Europe was not an easy question for the USA either. Landing craft had to be built, troops collected, ports organized, command structures created, and joint strategies coordinated with the British. The will to return to Europe was there, but the road to get there was long. Differing ideas soon arose between the Allies about how Germany should be defeated. The American leadership tended to launch a direct attack across the English Channel because it saw this as the shortest route to the heart of German power. Churchill, on the other hand, was more cautious. He remembered the bloodshed of the First World War and feared an ill-prepared landing that could end in disaster. Great Britain initially preferred operations on the fringes of Germany's sphere of influence, such as in North Africa, Italy, or the Mediterranean. This strategy was intended to weaken Germany, gain experience, and increase pressure without immediately taking the full risk of an invasion of France. Stalin saw the matter differently. For the Soviet Union, the situation was existential. The Red Army bore the brunt of the land war against Germany since 1941. Battles such as Moscow, Stalingrad, and later Kursk devoured enormous numbers of men and materials. Stalin therefore repeatedly called for a second front in the West to force the Wehrmacht to withdraw troops from the Eastern Front. From the Soviet point of view, Great Britain and the USA delayed the direct landing in France for too long. From the British and American perspectives, however, such an operation had to be thoroughly prepared, because failure could have set back the liberation of Europe by years. This tension remained an important political background to Operation Overlord. Meanwhile, the hope for liberation was growing in the occupied countries of Europe. In France, people lived under German occupation, economic exploitation, censorship, and repression. Some collaborated, others tried to survive, and still others joined the resistance. For them, the question of an Allied return was not abstract. It meant the possibility that the occupation could end. But it also meant danger, because any military liberation would entail bombing, fighting, and civilian casualties. So the coming attack was not just a military operation, but an event that would deeply affect people's lives. By 1943, it became increasingly clear that Germany could no longer wage the war as it had in the years of its victories. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. In North Africa, the Axis powers capitulated. In Italy, Mussolini was overthrown, and Allied troops landed on the European mainland. At the same time, the Allied air offensive against German cities, industrial plants and transport routes grew. Nevertheless, the German Reich remained dangerous. The Wehrmacht was weakened, but still capable of fighting. Their soldiers had experience, their tank units could lead heavy counterattacks, and the German leadership was prepared to continue the war with extreme severity. A landing in France would therefore not be a simple liberation march. Thus, defeat, perseverance, political pressure and military planning gave rise to the idea of a return to Western Europe. Operation Overlord was the answer to a question that had hung over the war since 1940. When and how would the Allies re-enter the continent? The English Channel was not just a waterway, but a border between hope and risk. On one side, ships, soldiers, planes and material gathered. On the other side, bunkers, mines, German troops and a regime that wanted to defend its rule with all its might awaited. Europe's darkest hour was not yet over, but it was in it that planning for the day when the return was to become a reality was already beginning. 2. Why Normandy was chosen. The decision in favor of Normandy was one of the most important decisions of the entire Operation Overlord. At first glance, it didn't seem to be a matter of course. If you looked at the map of Europe from the south of England, you first saw a much closer place, the Pas de Calais. The English Channel is narrowest there, the most direct route to northern France was there, and from there the shortest route led on to Belgium, the Netherlands and finally towards the Ruhr area, the industrial heart of Germany. This is precisely why the German leadership long expected the Allied invasion to take place at this point. But it was precisely this expectation that made Calais dangerous for the Allies. The German defenses were particularly strong there, the coastal fortifications were denser, the air bases and reserves were closer, and an attack would most likely have been met with a concentrated German reaction immediately. Normandy, on the other hand, offered more space, more surprise, and better opportunities to build a bridgehead before the Wehrmacht could fully assemble its forces. The choice of the landing site was therefore not a coincidence, but the result of a sober weighing of distance, defense, terrain, port possibilities, air support, deception, and political pressure. The Allies had to find a place close enough to Britain for ships, planes, and supplies to reach it, but not so obvious that the Germans concentrated all their defenses there. At the same time, they needed beaches where large units could land. Tanks, vehicles, guns, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies and food had to be brought ashore in a short time. An invasion was not just an attack by soldiers, but a logistical marvel. Every meter of beach, every road to the hinterland and every bridge could decide whether the landing was only a short break-in or became a permanent return to the continent. Normandy had several advantages. Its coast was still within the range of Allied fighter planes from southern England. This was crucial, because without air superiority, the invasion would hardly have been conceivable. The Allied bombers and fighters were to attack German positions, destroy transport routes, hinder supply movements, and cover the landing from the air. The farther away the invasion coast would have been, the more difficult this support would have been. At the same time, Normandy was far enough away from Calais to undermine German expectations. The German leadership considered Calais more likely because it seemed strategically obvious. The Allies deliberately exploited this expectation and made it the core of their strategy of deception. Another reason was the terrain. The Normandy coast offered various sections suitable for landings, although they were by no means easy to take. The 5 later landing beaches were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. They differed significantly from each other. Utah was located further west on the Cotentin Peninsula and was primarily intended to open the way to Cherbourg. Cherbourg was important because the Allies needed a deep water port in the long term. Omaha was located between high cliffs and was protected by strong German positions. Gold, Juno, and Sword were in the British-Canadian sector and were intended to open the way to Bayeux and Cannes. Cannes in particular played an important role in the planning, because the city was considered a traffic junction and the open areas south of it seemed suitable for later tank operations. But Normandy also had considerable disadvantages. Behind many stretches of coast began a landscape that was difficult for attackers, the bocage. This hedgerow landscape consisted of narrow paths, small fields, high hedgerows, and confusing terrain chambers. It was ideal for defenders. German soldiers were able to cleverly camouflage machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and artillery observers. For Allied tanks and vehicles, each field became a small battle area. The planners knew that the advance could be difficult after landing. Nevertheless, Normandy seemed to be a better compromise than Calais, because the initial defense was less dense there and the surprise could have a greater effect. The port question was particularly difficult. An army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers could not be permanently supplied by open beaches alone. Ports were usually indispensable. But the Germans also knew this and would have either defended large ports strongly or destroyed them before they were taken. Therefore, the Allies developed an extraordinary solution: artificial harbors, the so-called mulberry harbors. Huge concrete and steel elements were to be dragged across the canal and assembled off the coast. They were to make it possible to unload vehicles, equipment, and supplies directly in Normandy until a larger port was secured. This idea shows how much Operation Overlord depended on technical ingenuity and logistical planning. The choice of Normandy was therefore also possible because the Allies were prepared to solve the problem of missing ports with a new risky design. The decision in favor of Normandy was also closely related to deception. The Allies wanted to hide not only when the invasion would take place, but above all where. Operation Bodyguard, and in particular the Fortitude subplan, was intended to make the Germans believe that the main attack would take place near Calais. To this end, false radio messages were sent, dummies of tanks and vehicles were set up, fictitious troop formations were invented, and double agents were deployed. A particularly important role was played by the alleged 1st United States Army Group under General George S. Patton. Patton was considered by the Germans to be an aggressive and capable tank leader. If he seemed to be ready opposite Calais, it fit perfectly with German expectations. The deception was so successful that even after June 6, 1944, many German decision-makers believed that the Normandy landings might only be a diversionary attack and that the actual main thrust would follow at Calais. On the German side, the situation was contradictory. The Atlantic Wall was portrayed by propaganda as a huge fortress. In fact, it was heavily developed in some places, but incomplete in others. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was in charge of defending the coast, recognized the danger very clearly. He was convinced that the invasion on the beach had to be stopped. As soon as the Allies had built up a solid bridgehead, their air superiority and supply power would tip the scales. Other German commanders were thinking more about mobile counterattacks from the rear. But that was exactly what there was a dispute about. The tank reserves were not freely available, many decisions depended on Hitler personally, and the German command structure was complicated. The Allies could not plan for these weaknesses with certainty, but they knew that delays in the German response could bring valuable hours. The weather and the tides also influenced the choice of place and time. The invasion required a rare combination of moonlight for the airborne troops, suitable tides for the landing craft, and reasonably bearable weather for ships and aircraft. The beaches were equipped with obstacles, mines, and barriers. If the tide was too high, many of these obstacles would have been invisible, and if the tide was too low, the soldiers would have had to cover long distances under enemy fire. Normandy was therefore not an easy setting, but a place where every natural condition had to be included in the planning. The decision for this stretch of coast did not mean that it was easy to land there. It only meant that the chances there were better than in other places. Politically, the election was also significant. A landing in France had a different symbolic power than further operations in the Mediterranean. France had fallen in 1940, Paris was occupied, and German rule in Western Europe seemed to have been fixed for years. A return to France showed the world that the Western Allies were not only fighting on the fringes, but were returning directly to occupied Europe. This was of enormous importance for Charles de Gaulle and Free France, even if relations between him, Churchill and Roosevelt were by no means free of tensions. The liberation of France was not only to succeed militarily, but also politically in such a way that France could once again act as an acting state. In the end, Normandy was the choice of calculated risk. Calais was closer, but too obvious. Other stretches of coastline were further away, less accessible or logistically even more difficult. Normandy offered the opportunity to combine surprise, air power, deception, and huge supplies. It gave the Allies enough room for several landing beaches and the chance to build a bridgehead before Germany could fully deploy its reserves. But the decision remained dangerous. No one could guarantee that the landing craft would arrive on time, the paratroopers would reach their targets, the German batteries would be knocked out, or the soldiers would overcome the beaches. This is precisely why the choice of Normandy was so decisive. It was not the easiest place, but the place where success seemed possible. And in war, this difference can decide the fate of entire continents. 3. The Grand Alliance and its tensions. Operation Overlord was not only a military enterprise, but also the result of an unusual political alliance born out of necessity. The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union fought together against Nazi Germany, but they were not natural partners. Their political systems, their historical experiences, and their long-term interests differed considerably. This is precisely why planning the invasion of Western Europe was so difficult. Behind the landing craft, aircraft, and divisions were not only generals and soldiers, but statesmen, diplomats, and strategists who struggled for influence, trust, and the future order of Europe. The common enemy united them, but it did not erase their differences. Winston Churchill was one of the first Western politicians to clearly recognize the danger posed by Hitler and to oppose any idea of a compromise peace. For him, the war against Germany was not only a struggle for power, but for the survival of a European order in which Britain would continue to play a decisive role. Churchill thought strategically in imperial categories. He saw the war not only through the eyes of France or Germany, but in the context of the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, India, and the worldwide British Sea connections. That's why he was wary of an early landing in France for a long time. He knew that a poorly prepared invasion could end in disaster. The memory of Gallipoli in the First World War, where an amphibious operation had failed badly under his political responsibility, had an effect. Churchill wanted to weaken Germany before daring to launch the decisive attack. He initially preferred operations on the fringes of Europe, for example in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. This strategy was intended to wear down the enemy, tie up German forces, and buy the Allies time. Franklin D. Roosevelt pursued a different perspective. The United States had entered a global war after Pearl Harbor, which had to be fought simultaneously in the Pacific and in Europe. Roosevelt recognized early on that despite the Japanese attack, Germany had to be considered the most dangerous opponent because the Nazi Reich had the stronger industrial, military, and geopolitical basis. The American leadership therefore pushed harder for a direct strike against Germany. From the American point of view, the war could not be allowed to slide into secondary theaters of war for too long. A landing in France promised the shortest way to the decision. At the same time, the United States had the industrial power to make such an undertaking possible at all. Their factories supplied ships, trucks, tanks, planes, ammunition, and countless supplies. Without this American manufacturing power, Operation Overlord would not have been conceivable. But Roosevelt was not only commander-in-chief of a rising military state. He was also a politician who had the post-war order in mind. He wanted to avoid that the victory over Hitler would simply lead to the restoration of old European power politics. This complicated his relationship with Churchill. Both men respected each other, but they did not see the world the same. Churchill wanted to preserve the British Empire and secure Britain's position as a world power. Roosevelt was more skeptical of imperial structures and thought more strongly of an international order in which the United States played a central role. Behind the joint warfare was already the question of what the world would look like after victory. The relationship with Joseph Stalin was even more difficult. Since the German attack in June 1941, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the land war in Europe. The battles in the East devoured enormous quantities of men and material. Cities such as Leningrad, Stalingrad, and later Kursk became symbols of a war whose brutality was for a long time hardly fully understood in the West. Stalin knew that his armies weakened Germany decisively, but he deeply distrusted his Western allies. For him, the repeatedly postponed Second Front in France was proof that Great Britain and the USA wanted to bleed the Soviet Union dry. This mistrust was not only personal paranoia, but also an expression of the Soviet experience. The Red Army fought and died to an extent that the Western Allies could only understand directly on the continent later. Stalin's demand for a second front, therefore, became a constant means of exerting pressure. He demanded that the Western Allies finally land in France to withdraw German divisions from the Eastern Front. Churchill and Roosevelt could not ignore this pressure. They needed the Soviet Union, because without the Soviet resistance, Germany would hardly have been weakened in this way. At the same time, they feared that intervening too late in the West would enormously increase Soviet influence on Europe. The further the Red Army advanced to the West, the more the question arose as to who would control which territories after the war. Operation Overlord was thus also a political signal. The Western Allies returned to the continent before Europe was liberated and shaped exclusively by Soviet victories. In the midst of these political tensions, a military leadership structure had to be created that could work. At its head was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. Eisenhower was not the most spectacular general, not the most aggressive strategist, and not the man with the greatest personal myth. His strength lay in something else. He could keep people together. He understood that a coalition needed not only orders, but patience, diplomacy, and the ability to take into account national sensitivities. Americans, British, Canadians, French, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, and many other forces had to be involved in a joint operation. Each association brought its own traditions, expectations, and political interests with it. Eisenhower had to mediate, reassure, decide, and take responsibility. Under him, Bernard Montgomery played a central role in the planning of land operations. Montgomery was a capable, self-confident, and at the same time difficult British general. He had achieved success against Rommel in North Africa and was highly regarded by many British soldiers. For Overlord, he developed a plan to make the landing front wider than originally planned. He considered it necessary to land on several beaches with sufficient strength so as not to be trapped in a narrow bridgehead. His ideas had a considerable influence on the final form of the operation. But Montgomery's appearance repeatedly led to tensions, especially with American generals, who perceived him as arrogant. These personal frictions were not incidental, as they reflected the growing shift of power within the alliance. Great Britain brought experience, but the United States increasingly brought in the mass of troops and material. Charles de Gaulle was also a difficult but indispensable player. For the Allies, France was not simply an occupied territory, but a political problem. The Vichy regime had collaborated with Germany, while de Gaulle claimed to represent the real France from London. Roosevelt mistrusted him for a long time and considered him stubborn, arrogant, and difficult to control. Churchill, on the other hand, supported him for a time, but also often argued with him. De Gaulle insisted that France must not only be liberated, but restored as a sovereign nation. From his point of view, the liberation should not have the effect of an American-British occupation. This question was crucial, because the military landing had to be politically designed in such a way that it not only ended German rule, but also renewed French legitimacy. So the Grand Alliance was an alliance full of contradictions. It united democracies with a Stalinist dictatorship, imperial interests with anti-colonial ideas, military necessity with political mistrust. And yet it worked because the common opponent towered over all alternatives. Through his conquests, his policy of violence, and his ideological war of annihilation, Hitler had created a situation in which even deeply hostile systems had to work together. The Allies may have distrusted each other, but they knew that a German victory would have meant an even greater danger. Operation Overlord in particular showed how difficult and at the same time how effective this cooperation was. The Americans supplied industrial power and growing troop strength. The British provided experience, bases, intelligence networks, and years of war experience against Germany. The Canadians took on an important role on the landing front. The French resistance groups provided information, sabotaged transport routes, and prepared the internal convulsion of the occupying power. The Soviet Union continued to tie up most of the German land forces in the east. Without this simultaneous burden on Germany, the invasion of Normandy would have been incomparably more dangerous. But behind the joint victory, the future was already emerging. The question of who would liberate Europe was inextricably linked to the question of who would shape Europe afterwards. The Western Allies not only wanted to beat Germany, but also to prevent all of Europe from falling under Soviet influence. Stalin, on the other hand, wanted to create security zones and expand his influence to the West. Churchill was concerned about the balance of Europe, Roosevelt was thinking of international institutions and a new world order, de Gaulle was thinking of the honor and independence of France. Operation Overlord was therefore more than the plan of a landing. It was a hub of world politics. As preparations for the invasion became more concrete, all these tensions had to temporarily take a back seat to one goal. The English Channel was to be crossed, the German defenses were to be broken through, and a permanent bridgehead was to be created in France. But every decision, from the landing site to the command structure, bore the traces of political disputes. D-Day was therefore not only a day of soldiers on the beaches. It was also the result of countless conferences, compromises, disputes, and power calculations. The Grand Alliance was fragile, distrustful, and often cumbersome. But it was precisely their ability to act together despite all the differences that made Operation Overlord possible. 4. Planning an invasion without precedent. Operation Overlord was a military operation of a size that had never existed before. Although armies had crossed rivers, attacked coasts, and landed before, the return of the Western Allies to France demanded more than courage and a willingness to fight. It required planning in which almost every detail had to be considered. Soldiers had to be trained, ships built, beaches surveyed, airfields prepared, supply routes calculated, intelligence information evaluated, and political interests coordinated. It was not just a matter of bringing men to a hostile shore. The decisive factor was whether it would be possible to keep them there, supply them, and reinforce them quickly enough before the German Wehrmacht threw the bridgehead back into the sea. The planners were faced with a basic problem that accompanies every amphibious operation. The attacker comes across the water and is particularly vulnerable in the first few hours. It cannot unleash its full force immediately because vehicles, tanks, artillery, ammunition, and fuel must first be unloaded. The defender, on the other hand, knows the terrain, has prepared positions, and can point his weapons at the possible landing zones. In Normandy, this meant that German machine guns, artillery, minefields, barbed wire, beach obstacles, and fortified pockets of resistance were waiting for soldiers who would get out of landing craft seasick, exhausted, and often disoriented. If the first waves got stuck, the whole attack could be turned into a bloodbath. Therefore, the planning had to capture not only the attack itself, but also the moment afterwards, the construction of roads, supply depots, medical stations, radio links, and command posts. The logistical dimension was enormous. In the spring of 1944, huge quantities of people and material gathered in southern England. Entire regions became military gathering rooms. Streets were full of convoys of trucks, harbors full of ships, fields full of tents and depots. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops were waiting for the order to cross. For the civilian population, this presence was unmistakable, even if many details remained top secret. In the camps, maps were studied, attack routes were practiced, landing craft were boarded, orders were repeated, and equipment was checked. Every soldier was supposed to know what he had to do, but no one was allowed to know so much that a single mistake could betray the entire operation. Secrecy and preparation had to be agreed upon. A central problem was transport across the English Channel. The Allies needed a huge fleet of warships, landing craft, transport ships, minesweepers, tugs, and supply units. The landing craft were particularly important because they were intended to bring infantry, tanks, vehicles, and equipment directly to the beaches. There were different types for different tasks. Some were intended for soldiers, others for tanks, others for vehicles and supplies. This variety made planning complicated, because every boat had to be in the right place at the right time. An error in the schedule could cause tanks to arrive too late, infantry to be left without support, or supplies to land on a stretch of beach that was not yet secured. In addition, there was the danger of mines and German coastal batteries. Before the landing fleet could reach the beaches, deminers had to create safe fairways. Warships were to bombard German positions and cover the landings. But here, too, there were uncertainties. Bad weather could reduce the accuracy of shelling. Smoke, dust, radio problems, and incorrect situation reports could cause targets to be missed. The Luftwaffe was also to attack German fortifications, transport routes, and reserves. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, Allied planes bombed railway lines, bridges, junctions, and positions to delay the German response. However, the planners had to weigh up how much destruction was militarily necessary and how many civilian casualties were risked. The liberation of France began even before the landing, with bombs that also hit French towns and villages. The idea of artificial harbors was particularly bold. Since the Allies could not be sure to take a large port quickly, they developed the so-called Mulberry ports. Huge components were prepared in Great Britain, towed across the Channel, and assembled off the Normandy coast. They were to create floating roads, piers, and sheltered unloading areas. This plan was technically unusual and at the same time risky. The English Channel was not calm waters, and storms could jeopardize any construction. Nevertheless, the idea was necessary because an army in France needed enormous amounts of supplies every day. Ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies, and fresh troops had to arrive continuously. A successful landing that could not be supplied would only have been a delayed failure. In addition to the sea and land forces, the airborne troops played a decisive role. American and British paratroopers as well as glider troops were to be dropped behind the German lines the night before landing. Their task was to secure bridges, block road junctions, disrupt German counterattacks, and open important exits from the beach areas. Especially in the American sector near Utah Beach, airborne troops were to help control the connections to the hinterland. In the British sector, the securing of important bridges east of the Orne was of great importance. But airborne operations were dangerous. Pilots had to fly in the dark, often under fire, in difficult weather conditions and over unknown terrain. Many paratroopers were scattered, lost their equipment, or found their units only after hours. Nevertheless, it was precisely these scattered groups that could cause confusion behind the German lines. The planning also had to take into account the German reaction. The Allies knew that the Wehrmacht was still dangerous despite its burden on the Eastern Front and in Italy. German tank divisions in particular could be fatal to the bridgehead if they reached the coast quickly enough. Therefore, it was crucial to deceive, delay, and impede the German reserves with airstrikes. The Allied planners counted on destroyed bridges, damaged railway lines, and attacked roads to complicate the German advance. At the same time, the deception was intended to give the impression that Normandy was only a secondary attack. If German tanks were held back in anticipation of a second landing at Calais, Overlord would gain valuable time. In the headquarters, those responsible were aware that despite all the planning, many things remained unpredictable. Dwight D. Eisenhower bore the ultimate responsibility as commander-in-chief. He had to balance the interests of different nations, lead ambitious generals, and at the same time make a decision whose failure would have had enormous consequences. Under him, staffs worked on schedules, maps, supply lists, and orders. Bernard Montgomery coined the expansion of the landing front, insisting that the operation be broad enough to create room for maneuvering. Admiral Bertram Ramsay organized the massive naval force, while Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory was responsible for air operations. Each of these areas was complicated in itself. Together, they formed a company where a mistake in one part could weaken the effect of all the others. The training of the soldiers was also an essential part of the planning. Many men had never before attacked a coast in real combat conditions. They practiced abandoning landing craft, overcoming obstacles, advancing under fire, interacting with tanks and engineers, and behaving in the event of radio and command failures. Special vehicles were designed to clear mines, overcome trenches, remove obstacles, or provide fire support. Some of these vehicles seemed unusual, but they were the result of a clear experience. On a defended beach, technology could save lives if it arrived on time and worked. At the same time, the question always remained whether complicated devices would really do what was expected of them in the chaos of battle. The closer the attack came, the stronger the psychological tension grew. For the soldiers, the preparation was a mixture of routine, boredom, fear, and expectation. Many knew that a major operation was imminent, but not exactly when and where. Letters were written, equipment was checked, orders were issued. Some tried to hide their fear behind humor, others became quieter. The leadership could make plans, draw maps, and calculate probabilities, but it could not take away the fear of the individual people. Operation Overlord was a strategic operation in the files. For the men in the boats and planes, it was a personal boundary between life and death. In the end, planning Overlord was an attempt to master the unplannable as much as possible. The Allies could count ships, calculate tides, set bomb targets, and write orders. But they could not guarantee that the weather would hold, that the Germans would react incorrectly, that every boat would reach its beach, or that men under fire would do what was intended on paper. This was precisely the magnitude and danger of this operation. It was based on industrial power, military experience, technical ingenuity, and political will, but it remained dependent on chance, courage, and human resilience. Operation Overlord was therefore not a machine that was simply set in motion. It was a huge risk, prepared with the greatest precision and carried by the hope that the way back to Europe would emerge from planning, deception, and sacrifice. 5. Deception as a weapon. Operation Overlord wasn't just a matter of ships, soldiers, tanks, and planes. Equally decisive was an invisible battle that began long before June 6, 1944, in which maps, radio messages, rumors, double agents, dummies, and false expectations became weapons. The Allies knew that a landing on the French coast only had a real chance if the German leadership remained unclear about the place, time, and intention for as long as possible. The English Channel was narrow, the coast of France was being watched, and the German troops had been waiting for an attack for years. An invasion of this size could not be completely concealed. Too many ships had to be collected, too many soldiers had to be moved, too many depots had to be built, and too many radio connections had to be operated. Therefore, the art was not to make the preparation invisible, but to force a false interpretation of these visible signs on the opponent. The deception was embedded in a larger plan that became known as Operation Bodyguard. This plan was intended to deceive the Germans not only about Normandy, but about the entire Allied strategy. The German leadership was supposed to believe that attacks were imminent in various regions of Europe, such as Norway, the Balkans, or the Pas-de-Calais. The aim was to keep German troops as widely scattered as possible and to prevent them from being concentrated in time against the actual landing zone. There was a deep strategic logic in this thinking. The Allies did not have to defeat every German division before they landed. It was enough for many German units to wait in the wrong place. Orders were delayed and the decisive reserves were only set in motion when the Allied bridgehead was already in place. Particularly important was the deception around the Pas-de-Calais. This stretch of coast was the most obvious place for the Germans to invade. The English Channel was narrowest there. The shortest route led to northern France, and from there it was the fastest way to advance towards Belgium, the Netherlands, and the Ruhr area. This is precisely why Calais fit perfectly into the expectations of the German planners. The Allies not only exploited this expectation, they deliberately reinforced it. They wanted the Germans in Normandy to consider a landing possible, but still expect the main attack at Calais. This distinction was decisive. Even if the Germans realized on June 6 that Normandy had landed, they were supposed to believe that this was only a diversionary attack. The real blow, they were supposed to think, was still to come. To make this illusion credible, the Allies created an entire illusory world. In southeastern England, an alleged army group was established, the First United States Army Group. Their supposed commander was General George S. Patton. This choice was no coincidence. Patton was considered by the Germans to be a particularly energetic, aggressive, and successful commander. He was exactly the man who was expected to make a decisive attack. If Patton seemed to be facing Calais, then the deception was more convincing. The fictitious army consisted of invented units, simulated radio networks, false staff movements, and visible traces of military preparation. German reconnaissance planes were supposed to see things that confirmed their expectations. Mock-ups of tanks, vehicles, and landing craft stood in fields. From the air, such mock devices, correctly placed and photographed, could create the impression of a huge armed force. But deception did not only consist of dummies. Radio communication was a particularly effective instrument. Large military units usually generated a certain pattern of messages, orders, queries, and administrative traffic. If an army existed, it had to radio. If she didn't radio, her absence would have been suspicious. Therefore, Allied radio operators created an artificial news life for associations that did not exist in reality. These false signals were to be picked up by German radio reconnaissance and confirm the picture that large masses of troops were ready in the southeast of England. The deception was thus not only visual, but acoustic and organizational. It lived on details, because intelligence agencies are more likely to believe a lie if it does not appear perfectly smooth, but resembles the small irregularities of real military activity. Even more important was the network of double agents. In the course of the war, British counterintelligence had unmasked many German agents in Great Britain and in some cases turned them around. Under Allied control, they provided information to the German side, which was carefully controlled. Precisely because these agents were previously considered valuable, German authorities trusted their reports. One of the most famous was Juan Pujol Garcia, who worked under the alias Garbo. He built up a fictitious network of agents and provided the Germans with numerous reports that seemed credible. The decisive thing was not that everything was wrong. Good deception often contains true or half-true elements, so that the big lie does not attract attention. The Allies gave the Germans information that was sometimes verifiable and accurate in order to build trust. At the decisive points, however, they steered perception in the wrong direction. These double agents played a central role around D-Day. They were intended to reinforce the impression that Normandy was not the main attack. Even after the landing began, the deception continued. That was perhaps the most important part of the whole plan. A deception that ends on the morning of June 6th would only have facilitated the first blow. But the Allies needed more time. They had to secure their beaches, land supplies, care for the wounded, unload vehicles, and connect the individual landing zones. If German armored divisions had been immediately deployed at full strength against Normandy, the situation could have become dangerous. Therefore, the Germans had to hesitate as long as possible. The idea of an upcoming main landing at Calais became a protective shield for the young bridgehead. The air raids before the invasion also served to deceive. The Allies bombed transport routes, bridges, railway stations, and military installations not only in Normandy, but also in other regions of France. If they had attacked Normandy exclusively, the landing zone would have become too obvious. So the pattern had to look wider. The Germans were to have difficulty deducing the exact location of the invasion from the bombings. These attacks had a military function, because they hindered German movements, but at the same time a psychological and intelligence function. They create uncertainty. Every destroyed bridge could be part of a real plan or part of a deception. For a defender, such uncertainty is dangerous, because he cannot use his reserves everywhere at the same time. On the German side, the Allied deception met a leadership that was already burdened by its own expectations, rivalries, and command problems. Hitler was convinced that the decisive attack would probably come in the Calais area. This conviction was supported by geographical logic, German intelligence reports, and Allied deception measures in equal measure. Many German staffs also considered Calais to be the most likely main location. At the same time, there were indications of other possibilities, including Normandy. But in a war full of contradictory information, it is not the individual message that is decisive, but the pattern of interpretation into which it falls. The Allies had managed to create a pattern of interpretation that repeatedly made Calais seem plausible. The deception also worked because the Germans themselves could not judge their situation completely freely. The air superiority of the Allies made reconnaissance and troop movements more difficult. The war situation on the Eastern Front and in Italy tied up forces. The Atlantic Wall was long, but not equally strong everywhere. Rommel wanted to crush the invasion on the beach if possible, because he knew that the Allied material power would be almost unstoppable after a successful landing. Other commanders relied more heavily on mobile reserves in the hinterland. But the decision on important tank formations was not simply made by the frontline commanders. Hitler's interventions and the complicated command structure delayed reactions. So the Allied deception did not have to be a perfect lie alone. All she had to do was reach into a system that was already prone to hesitation and misjudgments. Deception should not be understood as a game without moral gravity. It was a means of war, and its goal was to have people fight and die in certain places while holding back other troops. For the Allied soldiers in Normandy, any German unit that remained at Calais because of the deception could mean the difference between life and death. For German soldiers, the deception meant that they followed orders based on false situational awareness. For the French civilian population, the deception and preparatory measures meant bombing, destroyed transport routes, and insecurity. The deception probably saved many Allied lives, but it was part of a war in which even liberation was associated with suffering. The success of this invisible battle was not shown in a single spectacular moment, but in delays, false assumptions, and withheld reserves. When the Allied troops landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Germans reacted, but not with the full speed and clarity that would have been necessary for a decisive counterattack. For days and even weeks later, the fear of a second landing at Calais remained. This gave the Allies time to consolidate their bridgehead. This time was more precious than every single deception document, every dummy, and every false radio message. It transformed uncertainty into strategic space. Operation Overlord would not have been possible without tanks, ships, planes, and infantry. But without deception, it would have become much more dangerous. The Allies had understood that modern warfare is not only decided on battlefields, but also in the minds of the opponents. If you make the opponent expect your strongest forces in the wrong place, you will change the balance of power before the first shot is fired. Normandy was therefore reached not only by landing craft, but also by a masterfully constructed illusion. Deception was not a minor matter of the invasion. It was one of their decisive weapons, quiet, patient, and effective, until a false expectation turned into a real Allied advantage. 6. Hitler's Atlantic Wall between propaganda and reality. The Atlantic Wall was one of the largest military construction projects of Nazi Germany, but its name was greater than its actual strength from the beginning. In German propaganda, it appeared as an impenetrable fortress, as a huge protective wall against any Allied landing, as concrete proof that Hitler's Reich could hold Western Europe permanently. On maps, newsreels, and in speeches, the impression was created that the coasts from Norway to southern France were secured by a closed chain of bunkers, guns, minefields, and obstacles. The reality was more complicated. The Atlantic Wall was not a continuous wall, but an uneven system of strong bases, weaker sections, unfinished installations, and improvised defensive positions. Some places were massively fortified, others remained vulnerable. It was precisely this gap between propaganda and reality that became a decisive factor in the spring of 1944. The idea behind the Atlantic Wall was understandable from a German point of view. After the defeat of France in 1940, Germany dominated large parts of the Western European coast. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that Britain and later the United States would one day try to return to the continent. The coast was thus not only an occupation area, but a possible front. Hitler wanted to prevent the Allies from gaining a foothold anywhere and forming a bridgehead from which they could reconquer Western Europe. The Atlantic Wall was intended to deter, delay, and ideally, crush any invasion on the beach. It was intended to show the Allies that an attack would be too expensive, and at the same time to prove to the German population that the Reich was also firm in the West. The construction of these fortifications consumed enormous resources. The Todt organization, forced laborers, prisoners of war, and local labor were used to build bunkers, gun emplacements, observation posts, shelters, ammunition rooms, and obstacles. Concrete was consumed in huge quantities, steel was scarce, and transport capacities had to be weighed against other military needs. Germany has long been fighting on several fronts. In the East, the war against the Soviet Union devoured unimaginable amounts of people and material. In Italy, Allied troops stood on European soil. The air war raged over German cities. Under these conditions, the Atlantic Wall could never become as complete as the propaganda claimed. It was an ambitious project in an empire that was coming under increasing pressure. Many fortifications in the Pas-de-Calais area were particularly strong, because the German leadership expected the most likely place of invasion there. The geographical proximity to England made this section logical from a German point of view. There the canal was narrowest. There seemed to be the shortest route for an Allied army to northern France. Therefore, a particularly large number of positions were expanded there. In Normandy, on the other hand, the defenses were not equally dense everywhere. There were strong points, coastal batteries, minefields, and resistance nests here as well, but the system was less closed than the idea of an insurmountable wall suggested. For the Allies, this was not an easy task, but a realistic opportunity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was commissioned to inspect and improve the coastal defense at the end of 1943, played a decisive role. Rommel had experienced in North Africa what Allied air superiority and material power could mean. He was convinced that an invasion could only be stopped in the first few hours. As soon as the Allies had brought enough troops, tanks, artillery, and supplies ashore, their superiority would become stronger and stronger. Rommel therefore thought from the beach. He wanted to compact minefields, erect obstacles, expand positions, and keep reserves closer to the coast. For him, the decisive fight had to take place directly at the waterline before the opponent could establish himself. However, this view was not alone. Other German commanders, including Gerd von Rundstedt, saw a greater need for mobile reserves in the rear. From their point of view, it was risky to station tank formations too close to the coast, where they could be destroyed early by Allied airstrikes. They wanted to first detect the Allied landings and then hit the bridgehead with concentrated tank forces. Both positions had a military logic, but they contradicted each other. Rommel's concept demanded proximity to the coast. Rundstedt's thinking demanded operational mobility. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that Hitler himself controlled important tank reserves. At a moment when quick decisions would have been necessary, the German command structure was cumbersome and politically overloaded. The Atlantic Wall itself consisted of many elements. Obstacles were erected directly on the beach to damage landing craft, stop tanks, and slow down infantry. Wooden poles, steel structures, concrete blocks, and explosive charges were supposed to hit the attackers in shallow water. Behind it were minefields, barbed wire, machine gun emplacements, and artillery posts. In some bunkers there were heavy guns that could act on sea targets or beach sections. Observers were to report the movements of the Allied fleet and direct fire. Particularly dangerous were well-camouflaged resistance nests, which did not necessarily have to be large to have a deadly effect. A single machine gun, properly placed and protected by concrete, could turn a stretch of beach into a death field. But concrete alone does not win a war. The quality of the German troops on the coast varied greatly. Some units consisted of experienced soldiers, others of older men, convalescents, poorly equipped units or so-called Eastern troops, i.e. soldiers from territories controlled or occupied by Germany, whose motivation and reliability were often doubtful from a German point of view. Many divisions were statically oriented, i.e. only limited mobility. They lacked vehicles, fuel and modern equipment. They were able to defend their positions, but could not be quickly moved over longer distances. This was a serious disadvantage, because an invasion required a quick reaction. In addition, there was the Allied air superiority. In 1944, the German Luftwaffe was no longer able to effectively protect the coast in the west. Allied planes increasingly dominated the skies, attacked transport routes, destroyed bridges, bombed train stations, and made any major troop movement in daylight difficult. For the Atlantic Wall, this meant that reinforcements could theoretically exist, but in practice they reached the front only slowly and with great losses. A fortification line is only strong if it can be supported, supplied, and reinforced in time. If this ability is missing, even good positions become isolated battlefields. Propaganda covered up these weaknesses. For Hitler and the German leadership, the Atlantic Wall also had a psychological function. He was supposed to radiate security, even though the strategic situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. After Stalingrad, after the defeats in North Africa, after the Allied landings in Italy, and in view of the bombing of German cities, the regime needed images of strength. Bunkers, guns, and soldiers on the coast were suitable for this. They conveyed order, toughness, and preparation. But the reality of the war could not be replaced by images at will. Ammunition was missing behind some concrete walls. Behind some positions, there was a lack of movable reserves. Behind some orders were rivalries, mistrust, and unrealistic expectations. Morally, too, the Atlantic Wall showed the dark side of German warfare. Much of the construction work was made possible by coercion and exploitation. People from occupied countries had to work under harsh conditions. Material was withdrawn from conquered territories. The coastal population lived under military control, in exclusion zones, with confiscations and constant fear. For the people of France, the Atlantic Wall was not a protection, but a symbol of occupation. He turned their coast into a front line and their villages into military areas. When the Allied bombing began, it became clear that these fortifications would not only endanger German soldiers, but would also draw French civilians into the coming battle. Despite all its weaknesses, the Atlantic Wall was not a mere illusion. This was particularly evident at Omaha Beach. There, terrain, German positions, insufficient effect of preparatory shelling, and chaotic landing conditions led to heavy American losses. The Atlantic Wall could be terribly effective at certain points. Its danger lay precisely in the fact that it was not equally strong everywhere, but could unleash a deadly concentration of fire and obstacles in individual sections. For the soldiers who got out of the landing craft, it did not matter whether the German propaganda had exaggerated. In front of them were real mines, real machine guns, and real bunkers. The German defense, however, suffered from the greatest strategic problem. It had to be ready everywhere, but nowhere could it know for sure where the main thrust would take place. The Allied deception increased this uncertainty. As long as Calais was considered a possible main attack, German reserves could not simply be completely thrown into Normandy. The Atlantic Wall was thus not only a fortification against a landing, but also a symbol of a defender who had to protect too many kilometers of coastline. Germany had created an empire of occupation, but there was an increasing lack of strength to defend this empire everywhere. On the eve of D-Day, the Atlantic Wall therefore stood between aspiration and reality. It was strong enough to inflict heavy losses on the Allies. It was dangerous enough to bring the landing on individual beaches to the brink of failure. But it was not strong enough to safely prevent the invasion. His bunkers could protect soldiers, but they could not correct false strategic expectations. His guns could hit landing craft, but could not break air superiority. His mines could kill men, but they could not permanently stop a huge Allied supply machine once it worked. Thus, the Atlantic Wall became a symbol of the situation of the German Reich in 1944. To the outside world, he showed toughness, concrete, weapons, and determination. Internally, however, overstretching, lack of resources, chaos of orders, and a dangerous dependence on Hitler's decisions were revealed. The Allies had to take this wall seriously, because it could be deadly. But they also knew that he was not invincible. The coming landing would not be against a mythical wall, but against a real, unequal, and vulnerable defense system. This was precisely the truth of the Atlantic Wall. It was at once threatening and fragile, brutal and unfinished, a tool of defense and a monument of propaganda. 7. The men who prepared the storm. Behind Operation Overlord were maps, orders, ships, planes, tanks, and enormous amounts of material. But all these things would have remained meaningless without the people who had to operate, move, plan, and use them at the decisive moment. The invasion of Normandy was not an abstract movement of arrows on a staff map. It was the work of millions of people, most of whom did not have famous names. Generals made decisions, politicians set goals, staffs drew up plans. But in the end, the weight of the operation was on the shoulders of ordinary soldiers, sailors, pilots, paratroopers, medics, engineers, radio operators, truck drivers, resistance fighters, and workers in the ports and depots. They were all preparing a storm that many knew could change or end their lives. In Sudetenland war im Frühjahr 1944 kam zu Überschen, das sich etwas Jultages zusammenzog. Strassen waren voller Militarfahrzeug, Felder wurden zu Lagerplatzen, Dorfer sehen plötzlich amerikanisch, British, Kanadisch und andere alliiert Uniformen. Junge Männer aus White entfernten Orten warteten auf einen Einsatz, dessen genauer Ortinnen meist verborgen blieb. Manch kamen aus amerikanischen Kleinstaaten, and ihr aus Industriestaaten Großbritanniens, aus kanadischen Provinzen, aus besetzten Ländern Europas oder aus den freien französischen Streitkräften. Viele hatten bereits Kämpfe erlebt, and ihr standen vor ihrer ersten Schlacht. Sie trainierten das Verlassen von Landungsbooten, das Überwinden von Draht und Hindernissen, das Verrücken unter Feuer, das Zusammenspiel mit Panzern und Artillerie. Wieder und wieder wurden ablauf gut, bis sie zur Gewohnheit wurden sollten. Doch Jetterwust, das keine Bung das wirklich Chaos eins verteidigten Strands vollständig nachbilden konnte. The infantrymen were the ones who would most visibly bear the price of the landing. They were to get out of narrow boats, run through water, mud, smoke and fire, and break the German resistance. Many of them were barely older than 20 years. They wrote letters home, joked, smoked, waited, played cards, or stared at the equipment they would soon need. Some were afraid and talked about it openly, others hid their fear behind indifference. In their bags were photos of families, girlfriends, wives, or children. In their minds, a sense of duty, camaraderie, uncertainty, and the hope that their own boat would not land exactly before the strongest German resistance were mixed. For her, Overlord was not first and foremost a strategy, but the thought of the next morning, of the weight of the backpack, of the man to the left and right of her, and of the question of whether you would function at the decisive moment. The pioneers and engineering troops played a special role. They were among the first to be needed on the beaches, and often among those most vulnerable. Their task was to blow up obstacles, clear mines, open paths for vehicles, repair damaged crossings, and later build bridges, roads, and supply points. Without them, tanks and trucks would not have been able to leave the beaches. A landing beach was not just a place of struggle, but a technical problem. Every wire entanglement, every concrete block, every mine, and every crater could slow down the advance. The engineers had to work under fire, often with heavy equipment, explosive charges, and an accuracy that seemed hardly possible in the midst of noise and fear. Her courage was rarely spectacular in the sense of grand gestures, but it was of practical, immediate importance. They turned a deadly coastal strip into a gateway to the continent. The sailors and crews of the landing craft also bore an enormous responsibility. They had to bring men across a troubled channel, through the danger of mines, darkness, smoke, and enemy fire. Many of them were not old sea dogs, but young men who had been trained in a short time for this special kind of war. Their boats were slow, cramped, and vulnerable. They had to stay on course, even though waves, currents, and visibility problems drove them away. If they touched down too early, soldiers had to wade through deep water. If they landed too late or on the wrong section, entire units could get mixed up. The men at the helm of the landing craft were not the focus of later heroic tales, but their decisions in seconds determined where and how the first waves came ashore. Above them, another group was preparing for deployment, the pilots and crews of the Allied air forces. In the nights and days leading up to the invasion, bombers attacked transport routes, batteries, train stations, and bridges, while fighter pilots were supposed to secure the skies over Normandy and crush German movements. Transport pilots had to bring paratroopers and gliders into the darkness. For them, the danger was not only in enemy fire, but also in navigation, weather, night flying, and the fear of dropping their own men in the wrong place. The air superiority of the Allies was a decisive advantage, but it was not a matter of course. It was based on countless missions, on technology, training, and losses that had already been made in the years before. If only a few German planes appeared over the beaches on D-Day, it was the result of a long air war that had largely pushed back the German Luftwaffe in the West. The paratroopers lived with a particularly special form of tension. They knew that before the actual landing they would jump behind the German lines, often in the dark, scattered over fields, swamps, hedgerows, and villages. They were supposed to secure bridges, close roads, disrupt German connections, and make it easier for the beach troops to reach the hinterland. But every paratrooper knew that a night jump rarely went the way it was planned on maps. Wind, anti-aircraft fire, navigational errors, and panic could tear units apart. Many would land alone or in small groups, without clear orientation, sometimes without a radio or heavy weapons. However, it was precisely this that had an unexpected effect. Scattered groups could give the Germans the impression that Allied troops had landed everywhere. Military disorder could lead to tactical confusion for the enemy. Next to the fighting troops stood the paramedics, doctors, and nurses, whose job was not to conquer territory, but to save lives where war destroyed bodies. They prepared first aid stations, hospitals, evacuation routes, and medical supplies. They knew that the first day would bring a flood of wounded. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, drowning, shock, and mutilations were among the expected horrors. Many medics went into battle unarmed or only lightly armed. They had to crawl to men under fire, stop blood, give morphine, decide who needed immediate help and who had to wait. Their work showed a different side of Overlord. In the midst of an operation that relied on destruction, there were people whose only job was to fight death. The Secret Service people, radio operators, and resistance fighters were also part of this preparation. In France, men and women of the resistance provided information about German troop movements, railway lines, depots, and fortifications. They sabotaged communication routes, cut cables, attacked transports, and helped down pilots or Allied agents. Her risk was enormous. Anyone caught by the Gestapo or German security forces had to reckon with torture, deportation, or shooting. For them, the invasion was both hope and danger. A successful landing could bring liberation, but the days before and after could intensify German retaliatory measures. The resistance did not fight with the means of a regular army, but it was an important part of the pressure exerted on the German occupying forces. On the other side of the coast, there were also people, not just anonymous representatives of a hostile system. German soldiers in the bunkers and positions waited for an invasion that many knew had to come. Some were staunch supporters of the regime, others were war-weary, some very young, others older, some experienced, others poorly educated. Among them were men from occupied territories who were in German service and often had only limited choices. They lived in a mixture of routine, fear, and uncertainty. They saw Allied planes in the sky, heard bombing in the hinterland, and yet did not know on which morning the actual landing would begin. For many German soldiers, the Atlantic Wall was less an impregnable fortress than a place of waiting, characterized by orders, propaganda, scarcity, and the premonition that the enemy's material power would be enormous. Above all, these men were commanders who also acted under pressure. Eisenhower had to bear responsibility for the whole thing. Montgomery, Ramsey, Lee Mallory, and others had to prepare and connect their respective areas. Rommel on the German side tried to improve coastal defenses because he sensed that the war in the West could be decided in the first hours of the invasion. But as important as the generals were, they could not control the coming battle down to the last detail. As soon as the first planes took off and the first boats crossed the channel, the big planning would dissolve into countless small situations. Then non-commissioned officers, lieutenants, boatmen, engineers, and individual soldiers would have to make decisions that could not be fully foreseen in any staff plan. The preparation for Overlord was therefore also a preparation for losing control. Every order tried to create order, but every experienced soldier knew that war breeds disorder. Radios could fail, units could land wrongly, officers could fall, maps could get wet, tanks could sink in the water, boats could arrive at wrong beaches. What counted then was training, initiative, and camaraderie. The men not only had to follow a plan, but also be able to act if the plan broke down. It was precisely this ability that became one of the silent prerequisites for success. As the time approached, a strange atmosphere hung over the camps in southern England. The men felt that the long preparation would end soon. Some were looking for peace and quiet, others were writing their last letters, and still others were going through their equipment again. Clergymen held church services, officers gave final instructions, doctors checked supplies, mechanics worked on engines, sailors inspected boats. No one could know what the next day would really look like. But everyone was part of a company that was bigger than their own lives. Some fought for the liberation of Europe, others for their comrades, some simply because the order had come and there was no way back. Operation Overlord was decided by statesmen and planned by generals, but it was prepared by people whose names are usually not in the great history books. Their work, their fear, their mistakes, and their courage formed the foundation of the invasion. They turned an idea into reality. When the ships finally left and the planes took off into the night, not only a military operation began. The moment began when millions of individual preparations, hopes, and fates headed for the Normandy coast. 8. The night before the attack. The night before the attack, there was a tension over southern England that hardly anyone could put into words. Soldiers had been training for months, ships had been loaded, maps had been checked, orders had been written and changed again. Entire stretches of England's coastline had become military gathering places. But now the moment had come when planning was to become reality. Operation Overlord was no longer just written on papers in staffs and storage rooms. It lived in the engines of airplanes, in the steel of ships, in the silence of the men on the landing craft, and in the decision of a commander-in-chief who knew that a mistake could cost countless lives. The night of June 6, 1944 was therefore more than a waiting time. It was the transition between preparation and history. Originally, the invasion was to begin on June 5th, but the weather over the English Channel deteriorated. Strong winds, low clouds, poor visibility, and choppy seas threatened the entire operation. For an amphibious landing, the weather was not just an inconvenience, but a matter of life and death. Landing craft could be drifted away, soldiers could arrive seasick and exhausted, planes could miss their targets, paratroopers could land widely scattered, and warships could use their guns worse. At the same time, the invasion could not be postponed at will. Hundreds of thousands of men were already in their assembly rooms, the fleet was prepared, secrecy was becoming more difficult with each passing day, and the right combination of moonlight, tides, and time of day would not last forever. Nature itself became a military factor in these hours. Dwight D. Eisenhower was at the center of this decision. As commander-in-chief of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, he had to weigh up the risk. He was surrounded by experienced commanders, meteorologists, and staff officers. but in the end the responsibility lay with him. The weather experts reported a short, more favorable time window for June 6th. It wasn't a perfect location, but maybe good enough. Eisenhower knew that waiting any longer could be dangerous. But he also knew that an attack under too bad conditions could destroy the entire plan. This tension showed the loneliness of military leadership. Bars provide assessments, maps show possibilities, numbers create the impression of order. But the final decision remains a human act, driven by experience, instinct, and the willingness to take responsibility for consequences that no one can fully control. When Eisenhower finally gave the order to begin the operation, it was not a triumphant moment. It was a difficult, almost sober decision. The words were short, but their weight was enormous. Thousands of ships were to set sail. Planes were supposed to take off. Paratroopers were supposed to jump into the darkness. Men who had never met became part of one huge plan. Eisenhower had even prepared a brief explanation in case the operation failed. In it, he took responsibility. This fact alone shows how uncertain success seemed. D-Day was not planned as a sure victory celebration. It was a gamble in which even the most careful preparation could not rule out the possibility that the beaches of Normandy would turn into a disaster. While the final decisions were being made in the headquarters, the soldiers moved to their embarkation points. Many men were silent. Others made jokes, not because their hearts were light, but because humor helped them to endure the fear. Some prayed. Some wrote last letters that were not to be sent until they did not return. The equipment was heavy. Weapons, ammunition, explosive charges, food, lifebelts, radios, medical supplies, and personal belongings made every step arduous. It was cramped, cold, and uncomfortable in the landing craft. The smell of oil, metal, wet clothes, and vomit was in the air. Many soldiers fell ill on the choppy seas even before they saw the enemy. But no one could get out. The canal was now the way to a future that could mean either liberation or death. That night, the airborne operations also began. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, as well as British airborne troops, were dropped behind the German lines. Their tasks were decisive. They were supposed to secure bridges, block roads, make German counterattacks more difficult, and help the landing troops leave the beaches. Especially at Utah Beach, it was important to control the exits from the flooded and difficult terrain in the backcountry. In the British section, bridges on the Orne and the Caen Canal were among other things, which were of great importance for the protection of the eastern flank. These missions were extremely risky. The planes flew in the dark, often under anti-aircraft fire, through clouds and wind. Many pilots struggled to maintain their formations and find the right drop zones. The reality of the night quickly deviated from the plans. Many paratroopers did not land where they were supposed to land. Some were scattered for miles, some fell into swamps, fields, or villages. Others lost their weapons or could not find their units again. Gliders broke during hard landings. Men were injured before they could even fight. But out of this chaos came an unexpected advantage. Small groups of Allied soldiers appeared in many different places, confusing the German defenders. It was difficult for German staffs to see how big the airborne landing actually was and where the center of gravity was. What initially seemed like disorder from the Allied point of view created uncertainty on the German side. Individual officers and non-commissioned officers had to improvise, gather men, redefine targets, and act without being able to wait for clear orders. It was precisely this ability to take the initiative that became vital that night. On the German side, the situation was characterized by uncertainty. The troops on the coast knew that an invasion was coming, but not when and not where. The Allied deception had continued to draw attention strongly to the Calais area. In addition, the bad weather was a reason why many German commanders did not expect an immediate attack. Erwin Rommel was not at the front, but in Germany, partly because of his wife's birthday and because he wanted to talk to Hitler about the situation. Other commanders could be reached, but the German command structure was cumbersome. Crucial tank reserves could not simply be deployed immediately. Many reports from the night were unclear, contradictory, or were initially understood as part of diversionary actions. It was precisely this delay that was precious to the Allies. The French civilian population experienced this night in their own way. In the villages and towns of Normandy, people heard planes, explosions, and distant roars. Some suspected that the liberation might have begun. Others were afraid of bombing, German retaliation, or fighting in the immediate vicinity. For the resistance, certain radio signals and coded messages were a sign that the expected moment had arrived. Sabotage actions against railway lines, telephone connections, and roads were intended to make the German reaction more difficult. But the night was also dangerous for resistance fighters. Those who were caught had to reckon with torture or shooting. Deliverance was not a sudden light without shadows. It began with danger, noise, uncertainty, and the possibility of getting caught between the fronts. While the paratroopers were already fighting, the largest invasion fleet in history was approaching the French coast at sea. Warships, transports, landing craft, minesweepers, and supply ships moved through the canal. For the sailors, this trip was an enormous achievement. The fleet had to remain orderly, fairways had to be cleared, schedules had to be adhered to. In the dark and in rough seas, this was difficult. A collision, a navigational error, or a wrong course could have serious consequences. But the Armada moved on slowly, inexorably, accompanied by the knowledge that bunkers, guns, and mines were waiting on the other side of the water. In the minds of the men, personal thoughts mingled with the magnitude of the event. Some thought of home, parents, wives, children, or siblings. Others thought of the comrade next to them. Still others tried not to think at all. Most of them knew why they were fighting, but that didn't make the fear any less. Liberation, democracy, victory over Hitler, return to Europe, these were big words. In the boats and airplanes, they became something very concrete. They meant setting foot on a beach, walking through water, not standing still, helping a wounded person, following an order, or deciding for yourself after an officer's death. The night before the attack was therefore a moment between two worlds. Behind the Allies lay years of defeats, waiting, planning, and construction. In front of them lay a coast where it would be decided whether these years of preparation would last. In London, Washington, and Moscow, political leaders were waiting for news. In France, millions of people were waiting for a sign that the occupation could end. In German headquarters, attempts were made to interpret reports without recognizing the whole picture. And somewhere over Normandy, parachutes hung in the dark, while men stumbled through hedges, ditches, and fields below, searching for their units and their targets. As morning approached, Operation Overlord was already irreversible. The first battles had begun, the fleet was underway, the air was full of machines, and the day that would go down in history as D-Day was on the horizon. The beaches were still in semi-darkness. Many German defenders were still waiting in their positions. The soldiers in the boats did not yet know what kind of fire awaited them. But the decisive step had been taken. The return to Western Europe had begun, not with a single loud thud, but with a long night of decisions, fear, error, courage, and movement. The world held its breath as the Normandy coast lifted out of the fog in the gray light of the next day. 9. The morning of June 6, 1944. When the first gray light appeared over Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944, the decision had already begun. The night had been filled with the noise of engines, scattered paratroopers, burning planes, radio messages, explosions, and hasty German reports that did not yet give a clear picture. But now the real core of Operation Overlord was approaching. Off the French coast lay a huge Allied fleet. Warships, transports, landing craft, minesweepers, and supply units moved towards the beaches, which would go down in history under the code names Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. For the men in the boats, this moment was no longer strategic or political. He was physically noticeable. Cold water crashed against metal, engines vibrated, the smell of oil and vomit hung in the air, and everyone knew that the boat's ramp would soon fall. Before the attack, Allied planes and warships had bombed German positions. The hope was to hit coastal batteries, bunkers, machine gun nests, and communication lines so hard that the first waves of landings would meet with less resistance. But war can rarely be prepared as cleanly as it appears on maps. In some sections, the bombardments had a devastating effect. In others, they missed important targets or caused less damage than expected. Smoke, dust, bad weather, poor visibility, and the fear of hitting one's own troops reduced the effect. Many German defenders survived the shelling in bunkers and dugouts. As the landing craft approached, they crawled out of their covers, aiming machine guns and guns, waiting for the moment when the attackers stood vulnerable in the water and on the open beach. At the westernmost landing section, Utah Beach, the American troops had comparatively favorable conditions despite all the dangers. The current drove a few units further south than planned, but this mistake proved to be a stroke of luck. The German defenses were weaker there than at the originally planned location, and the American units found their way out of the beach area more quickly. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who landed with the first wave despite his age and health problems, recognized the situation and is said to have decided that the war would be started from where it had landed. This ability to improvise was typical of the day. Many plans were shattered by reality, weather, fire, and chance, but where officers and soldiers acted quickly, mistakes could be turned into advantages. The airborne troops in the rear, although widely scattered, also helped to disrupt German movements and secure important routes. The situation at Omaha Beach was completely different. There, American soldiers encountered a particularly difficult combination of terrain, German defense, and failed preparation. The beach lay below heights and steep slopes, from which German positions dominated the open terrain. Many amphibious tanks were lost in the rough seas or arrived too late. The preparatory shelling had not eliminated numerous German positions. When the first boats opened their ramps, the men were caught in murderous fire. Many have already been hit in the water. Others sank under the weight of their equipment. Radios failed, units were thrown into disarray, officers died, and for a time the attack on this section seemed to be on the verge of failure. Omaha became the epitome of the cruelty of D-Day because it was here that the distance between planning and reality became particularly brutally visible. But Omaha Beach also showed that a battle is not only decided by orders from above. Small groups of soldiers began to work their way forward through wire, mines, and fire. Engineers blew up obstacles. Infantrymen sought cover in craters and on beach walls. Individual officers and non-commissioned officers gathered men who were no longer with their original units. There was no clear, orderly advance, but many small acts of determination. Men crawled, ran, fell, got up again, and fought their way to the exits of the beach. The German defense was strong, but it was not equally dense everywhere. As soon as the first groups reached the heights and resistance nests could attack from the side or from behind, the situation slowly began to change. The price was terrible, but the beach was not abandoned. Further east, British troops landed at Gold Beach. Here, too, obstacles, mines, and German positions were dangerous, but the support of special tanks and the sometimes more effective shelling helped to overcome the defenses. The British units fought their way into the rear and reached important places and communication areas. Their goal was not only to capture the beach, but also to connect with the neighboring landing sections and advance towards Bayeux. As everywhere in Normandy, it turned out that the beach was only the beginning. Only when roads, villages, and land junctions behind the coast were secured could a landing become a bridgehead. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops met with heavy resistance. The defenses were strong, the seas difficult, and many landing craft arrived later than planned. As a result, the tide was already higher, and beach obstacles became more dangerous. Canadian soldiers suffered heavy losses, especially in the first waves, but they fought their way forward with remarkable energy. House by house, position by position, street by street, they penetrated into the hinterland. Canadian participation in Operation Overlord was of great importance, not only militarily, but also politically and nationally. Canada was not a minor player, but played its own heavy part in the liberation of Western Europe. The men who ended up at Juno were in a tradition of earlier victims, especially since the costly attack on Dieppe in 1942, the lessons of which had been incorporated into later planning. British troops landed on the easternmost beach, Sword Beach, with the aim of advancing towards Cannes and protecting the eastern flank of the bridgehead. Cannes was an important transport hub and played a major role in Allied planning. The British troops were able to secure the beach, but the rapid advance on Cannes did not succeed as hoped. German resistance, delays, terrain problems, and the danger of counterattacks slowed down the advance. Particularly significant was the proximity of German tank forces, which could pose a serious threat on the eastern edge of the invasion area. Nevertheless, the British managed to establish a connection with the airborne troops, who had secured important bridges during the night. These bridges became symbols of how precisely individual targets could determine the success of larger operations. While fighting was going on the beaches, the German leadership tried to understand what was happening. The reports were chaotic. Airborne landings, sea attacks, bombings, and sabotage actions created a confusing picture. Many German authorities initially did not know whether Normandy was the main attack or just a diversionary tactic. The Allied deception had an effect. The expectation of another landing at Calais remained and influenced the decisions. In addition, the German command structure was cumbersome. Tank reserves could not simply be used immediately and freely. Some orders were delayed, some messages were weighted incorrectly, some commanders waited for higher approval. In a situation where hours were of the essence, this hesitation became an Allied advantage. For the French people, the morning of June 6th was a moment between hope and terror. In many places, people heard the thunder of ships, the roar of planes, and the explosions of bombs and grenades. Some hardly dared to believe that the liberation had actually begun. Others hid in basements, fearing German retaliation or Allied bombs. Norman villages, fields, and roads suddenly became the center of world history. The people there were not just spectators. Their houses, churches, farms, and families got caught between the fronts. The liberation did not come as a solemn march, but as a storm of fire, smoke, death, and uncertainty. Despite all the differences between the 5 beaches, the morning of D-Day can be described as a battle against time, terrain, and confusion. The Allies had to be faster than the German reaction. They had to overcome the beaches before reserves arrived. They had to create gaps before the flood covered obstacles or blocked supplies. They had to care for the wounded, unload vehicles, rearrange orders, and establish contact between scattered units. Each beach had its own conditions, its own mistakes, its own sacrifices, and its own successes. There was no uniform D-Day, but many D-Days at the same time, experienced from the point of view of a paratrooper in the dark, a sailor in a landing craft, a paramedic on the beach, a German soldier in the bunker, and a French child in the basement. At the end of this morning, victory was by no means certain. The Allies had gained a foothold on all 5 beaches, but the beachhead was still vulnerable. The landing zones were not connected everywhere as planned, important objectives had not yet been reached, and German counterattacks remained possible. Omaha in particular had shown how close success and failure were. But the decisive first step had been taken. The Wehrmacht had not been able to throw the landing back into the sea. Thousands of Allied soldiers stood on French soil, supplies began to arrive, and the liberation of Western Europe had received a real basis. The morning of June 6, 1944 was therefore not a clean triumph, but a chaotic, bloody, and uncertain breakthrough. It showed all the harshness of modern warfare, industrial planning and personal suffering, technical preparation and human improvisation, political hope and immediate violence. The men who landed that morning often did not know whether the operation was successful overall. They saw only water, sand, smoke, comrades, fire, and the next meter in front of them. But from these individual meters, a historic turning point emerged. With every obstacle overcome, every safe exit, and every position held, the risk of the night became a reality during the day. The Allies were back in France, and Nazi Germany now had to face a war on a new front that it had not been able to prevent, despite concrete, propaganda, and orders. 10. Omaha Beach and the price of liberation. Omaha Beach became the bloodiest and most famous section of D-Day, because all the uncertainty of Operation Overlord was concentrated there in a few hours. On the maps of the Allied planners, Omaha was a necessary link between Utah Beach in the west and the British-Canadian landing zones in the east. Without this section, the Allied bridgehead could have remained torn apart. The American troops had to land here, overcome the German positions, open the exits from the beach area, and establish contact with the neighboring forces. But what appeared to be a task on maps turned into a fight for bare survival for the men of the first waves on the morning of June 6, 1944. Omaha was not a place where victory seemed like an inevitable consequence of superior planning. Omaha was the beach where everything could have failed. The terrain alone made this section particularly dangerous. The beach was wide, open, and dominated by hills. Behind the sand lay gravel, beach walls, barbed wire, minefields, and narrow exits that led through valleys and incisions into the hinterland. Whoever controlled these exits controlled the way away from the beach. The German defenders had laid out their positions in such a way that they could cover the open areas with machine guns, mortars, artillery, and anti-tank weapons. For the attacking soldiers, this meant that they could hardly find cover after leaving the landing craft. Every step across the beach was in the view and fire of the enemy. The nature of the terrain turned the attack into a nightmare, because the Americans were fighting not only against German soldiers, but against a space that was almost ideal for defense. The Allied planners had tried to reduce this danger by bombing and fire support. Aircraft were to hit German positions, warships were to fire at bunkers and guns, special vehicles and engineers were to clear obstacles. But on Omaha Beach, part of this preparation failed or fell short of expectations. Many bombs fell too far inland because the crews did not want to fall short for fear of hitting their own troops. The shelling of the warships could not eliminate all German positions, especially since many were well protected or cleverly camouflaged. When the first landing craft approached, many defenders were still fit to fight. The men in the boats may have thought they were finding a badly wounded opponent. Instead, the ramps opened off a coast that was still deadly awake. The sea itself also worked against the attackers. Waves, currents, and smoke made orientation difficult. Some units landed on the wrong sections. As a result, units became confused, officers could not find their men, and soldiers suddenly stood next to comrades with whom they had never trained. Many amphibious tanks that were supposed to support the infantry did not reach the beach or arrived too late. Some have already sunk in the rough seas because they were released too far out and the conditions were worse than expected. Thus, the first waves lacked exactly the firepower they would have urgently needed against fortified positions. Infantrymen, who were already heavily loaded, now had to advance without sufficient support through an area dominated by German fire. When the ramps of the landing craft fell, a moment began for many soldiers that almost eluded any later description. Men were hit before they could even leave the boat. Others jumped into the water and sank under the weight of their equipment. Some reached the beach exhausted, drenched and disoriented, only to find that they could hardly find cover. Screams, explosions, machine gun fire, smoke, and the crash of the surf mixed into a chaos in which orders could often no longer be heard. Radios were wet or destroyed, officers fell, medics worked under fire, and wounded lay in the sand while new boats brought more men. The beach became a place where military planning disintegrated into individual seconds. The German defenders used their advantages to deadly effect. They were not equally strong everywhere and not all belonged to elite units, but their positions were well placed. Especially the higher positions allowed fire on the open beach areas. Machine guns could seal off landing zones, mortars could smash groups, snipers and artillery observers could direct or stop movements. Many German soldiers were also afraid, under pressure, and did not know how big the attack really was. But as long as they remained in their bunkers and trenches and their weapons worked, the Americans had to pay for every meter. For the men on the beach, it didn't matter if the Atlantic Wall was incomplete as a whole. On this section, it felt like a deadly wall. In such moments, a battle is often decided not by the original plan, but by people acting in the midst of the collapse. On Omaha Beach, small combat groups emerged from scattered remnants of individual units. Men who had lost their officers followed other non-commissioned officers or joined foreign groups. Infantrymen crawled to beach walls, collected ammunition, looked for weak points, and felt their way to the slopes. Some officers stood up, not because they were not afraid, but because they knew that standing still was more deadly than moving. The attack did not win through order, but through tenacious, often desperate initiative. The path from the waterline to the heights was short on the map, but infinitely long for the men who had to walk it. Every crater, every bump, every little cover became precious. The wounded cried out for help, but helping meant getting caught in the fire yourself. Paramedics had to decide who to treat first. Soldiers had to walk past comrades they knew, because stopping would have paralyzed the attack for good. Here the moral price of liberation became particularly sharp. The operation was necessary to liberate Western Europe from Nazism, but it required individuals to experience and do things that no political goal could undo. Liberation was not an abstract ideal that morning. She had faces in the sand, blood in the water, and voices that were drowned out in the noise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the situation began to change. Not through a single big breakthrough, but through many small successes. Individual groups reached the steep slopes, found ways through minefields, bypassed pockets of resistance, and attacked German positions from the side or from the rear. As soon as the defenders could no longer only work forward on the beach, their system lost its coherence. Warships moved closer and fired at recognized positions. Some destroyers took great risks to support the infantry directly. This fire support helped to silence German weapons or to suppress their operations. The beach remained dangerous, but the rigidity of the first hours began to break up. The German side did not immediately recognize how critical and at the same time how limited its chance was. If strong reserves could have been used quickly and concentrated against Omaha, the situation would have become even more dangerous for the Americans. But the German response was delayed by air raids, destroyed communications, unclear messages, Allied deception, and a cumbersome command structure. In addition, the events along the entire coast were confusing. Airborne landings in a hinterland, attacks on 5 beaches, and the expectation of a possible further landing near Calais made it difficult to clearly identify the center of gravity. So the Americans gained exactly what they needed most on Omaha Beach: time. Time to get men away from the waterline, time to bypass pockets of resistance, time to open the first paths into the hinterland. By the afternoon, Omaha was still not a safe place, but the worst moment had been overcome. The landing had cost terrible losses, but it had not failed. Small groups had reached the heights, German positions were eliminated, and the beach could gradually be used for further supplies. Many of the original goals of the day were not fully achieved, but the decisive thing had succeeded: the Americans had stayed. They had not been thrown back into the sea. In the logic of Operation Overlord, this was invaluable, because a secured Omaha Beach connected the western and eastern parts of the Allied bridgehead and prevented a dangerous gap between the landing zones. Omaha Beach was later often remembered as a symbol of heroism, and rightly so. But pure heroic narratives are not enough to understand this place. Omaha was also a symbol of miscalculations, technical difficulties, incomplete fire, coincidence, and the battlefield's brutal indifference to plans. Many men died not because they were careless or because they lacked courage, but because they got into a situation that could hardly be humanely managed. Others survived not only by bravery, but by chance, by a bump, by the failure of a German weapon, by the help of a comrade, or by a decision made in seconds. In such moments, history does not emerge cleanly, but from a mixture of planning, mistakes, courage, and luck. This is precisely why Omaha Beach still stands for the price of liberation today. D-Day was a step towards the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of occupied countries. But this step was taken by young men who had no guarantee of meaning, fame, or return. Many of them died before they reached more than a few meters of French soil. Others carried the memory of this beach with them for the rest of their lives. For the French population, the landing meant hope, but also destruction and civilian casualties. For the German side, Omaha was a phase of a war that Hitler's regime had started and radicalized, the burden of which now also fell on soldiers fighting in a collapsing defense system. On the evening of June 6th, Omaha Beach was no longer just a name on a map. It was a place of suffering, perseverance, and decision. The Allies had not won an easy victory there. They had held an almost lost beach by blood, improvisation, and stubborn will. This made Omaha one of the strongest symbols of Operation Overlord. Not because everything went according to plan there, but because it became apparent what liberation means in war. It can be necessary and at the same time cruel, strategically correct and humanly hardly bearable, historically great and personally destructive. Omaha Beach reminds us that the path to the liberation of Europe was not only through conferences, maps and orders, but through sand, water, fire, and the courage of men who could not retreat in one of the darkest moments. 11. German reactions and missed opportunities. When the first reports of Allied airborne landings, sea movements, and attacks on the Normandy coast reached the German command posts, the situation was anything but clear. During the night and early morning of June 6, 1944, contradictory news reached the German staffs. Paratroopers had landed in various places, bridges were attacked, radio communications were disrupted, Allied planes dominated the skies, and a huge fleet was looming off the coast. However, individual observations did not immediately provide a clear overall picture. Was this the long-awaited main invasion? Or was it a diversionary tactic while the actual attack was still imminent at the Pas de Calais? It was precisely this uncertainty that was one of the greatest successes of the Allied strategy of deception. It hid a German leadership that was already suffering from internal contradictions, rigid lines of command, and Hitler's personal control. The German side had been expecting an Allied landing for years. No one in the high command seriously believed that Britain and the United States would permanently renounce a return to Western Europe. The question was not if, but when and where. The Pas de Calais was considered by many to be the most likely place because the English Channel was narrowest there, and the route to northern France and on to the Ruhr area seemed most direct. The Allies had cleverly reinforced this expectation. False radio networks, double agents, dummies, and the apparent concentration of a large army under George S. Patton in southeast England had influenced the German situation. For this reason, Normandy was not completely ruled out, but for a long time it was not recognized as a final focus. When the invasion actually began there, the German leadership remained dangerously long caught up in the idea that it could be a first blow, which would only be followed by the main attack at Calais. This uncertainty had an immediate effect on the use of reserves. The German defense plan suffered from a fundamental dispute. Erwin Rommel was convinced that the invasion had to be stopped directly on the beaches. His experience in North Africa had shown him what Allied air superiority and material strength meant. Once the Allies had built up a secure bridgehead, they would bring more soldiers, tanks, guns, trucks, and supplies ashore day by day. Then it would hardly be possible to throw them back. Rommel therefore wanted to keep tanks and mobile forces as close as possible to the coast so that they could be used immediately against the landing zones. For him, the first hours counted. Gerd von Rundstedt and other German commanders thought otherwise. They feared that tank formations near the coast would be smashed by Allied airstrikes and naval artillery before they could even fight effectively. From their point of view, mobile reserves had to be kept in the hinterland and only used in a concentrated manner when the actual center of gravity of the landing had been identified. Both views had a military logic, but the German leadership did not find a clear balance. Instead, a compromise was created that combined the disadvantages of both concepts. Some forces were closer to the coast, others farther inland, and the main tank reserves were subject to Hitler's personal clearance. This made the German reaction vulnerable at the point where it should have been the fastest. Hitler's role was decisive. In the National Socialist system, more and more military decisions came his way. His generals could advise, warn, or make suggestions. but he reserved the decision on central issues. This system had led to delays and wrong decisions before, but on D-Day it seemed particularly difficult. When the invasion began, Hitler was not immediately involved in the decision on the situation, and even when reports were available, the interpretation remained uncertain. The release of important tank units did not take place with the speed that the situation would have demanded. In a modern war of movement, a few hours can make the difference between success and failure. On June 6th, such hours were lost. Rommel's absence was also later often seen as a symbol of Germany's failures. On the day of the landing, he was not at his headquarters in France, but in Germany. The bad weather had increased the expectation that an invasion was immediately unlikely. Rommel also wanted to call on Hitler and take care of private affairs. His absence alone did not decide the battle, but it shows how much even experienced German commanders were surprised by the timing. The Allies had taken advantage of the short weather window, which many German observers did not consider likely at the time. When Rommel returned, the decisive first part of the day had already passed. The German reaction at the front varied from place to place. In some sections, the defenders fought hard and inflicted heavy losses on the Allies. Especially on Omaha Beach, the German positions showed how deadly the Atlantic Wall could be at individual points. There, the American landing was at times in great danger. There was also determined resistance, delays, and dangerous counterattacks on other beaches. But local toughness could not solve the strategic problem. The Wehrmacht not only had to defend individual beaches, but also to understand, classify, and respond to a huge Allied operation with mobile forces. This is exactly where she failed. Another problem was Allied air superiority. Even when German units received the order to counterattack, their path to the front was dangerous and slow. Roads, bridges, and railway junctions had already been bombed before the invasion. Resistance groups sabotaged connections and made movements even more difficult. In daylight, German columns had to reckon with attacks by Allied fighter bombers. Vehicles were destroyed, marching routes had to be changed, units arrived late or fragmented. Tank formations are only crucial if they can be deployed in a concentrated, timely manner and with sufficient supplies. In Normandy, however, they were often worn out or stopped on the way to the front. The German commanders were also faced with an information problem. The invasion did not only consist of landings on 5 beaches. It included airborne operations, naval shelling, airstrikes, sabotage, fake news, and the ongoing threat of another attack. The German leadership had to decide which messages were important and which were just a distraction. In such a moment, an already formed expectation is particularly dangerous. Those who consider Calais to be the main setting interpret Normandy more easily as an advance with a limited purpose. Anyone expecting a second landing is holding back reserves. That is exactly what happened. German forces, which could have been important for a counterattack in Normandy, remained partly tied up because the supposed main attack was still expected. At the same time, the German failures must not be presented as if a single quick order had automatically brought victory. The Allies were strong, well prepared, and materially superior. Her navy supported the landing with tremendous firepower. Their air force dominated the skies. Their supply organization was geared toward a long struggle. Even a faster German counterattack would have had enormous difficulties. Nevertheless, it remains true that the first hours offered the best German chance. As long as the Allied troops were still stuck on the beaches, as long as vehicles, artillery, and supplies had to be unloaded, as long as the landing zones were not yet fully connected, the bridgehead was vulnerable. This opportunity was not used consistently. An example of the limited German response capability was the deployment of the 21st Panzer Division in the Cannes area. It was one of the few German tank forces that stood relatively close to the invasion area. Parts of this division were actually able to advance towards the British-Canadian landing zones on June 6, creating a dangerous situation at times. But even this counterattack was not strong enough to decisively crush the landing. The division was not in ideal shape, its movements were complicated by airstrikes and command problems, and it could not be combined with other tank forces for a powerful joint strike. Thus, on a small scale, the larger German problem became apparent. Existing forces were deployed, but not quickly enough, not concentrated enough, and not in the right strategic context. German propaganda had portrayed the Atlantic Wall as an impregnable fortress, but on D-Day it became clear that a fortress without clear leadership, quick reserves, and air defense had only limited value. Bunkers could control individual sections of beach, but they could not replace operational mobility. Mines could destroy landing craft, but they could not prevent new waves of material and people from following when the first bridgehead held. Machine guns could cause terrible losses, but they could not sink Allied warships, drive away fighter bombers, or correct false situational awareness. The defense was strong at individual points, but too cumbersome as an overall system. Among the missed opportunities was also the inability to soberly accept political and military reality. Hitler and parts of the German leadership clung to ideas that were better suited to their own expectations than to the actual situation. The idea that Normandy could only be a distraction was not entirely irrational, but it was maintained for too long. In a war in which deception played a central role, caution was understandable. But at some point, leadership has to decide. The Allies had counted on the German leadership to delay this moment. The deception did not have to work forever. It only had to work long enough for men, vehicles, and guns to come ashore. For the soldiers at the front, these higher failures were often not visible. A German machine gunner in a resistance nest, an American infantryman on Omaha Beach, or a British soldier at Sword Beach did not think of Hitler's command structure or strategic deception. He experienced immediate violence. But the sum of delayed orders, false expectations, and blocked reserves determined whether this violence led to a German defensive success or to an Allied breakthrough. History is often decided where large structures and individual seconds meet. By the end of June 6th, Germany's chance of throwing the invasion into the sea immediately was largely lost. The Allies had gained a foothold on all 5 beaches. Not everything had gone according to plan. Many goals were still unachieved, and the bridgehead remained at risk. But the decisive threshold had been crossed. Every additional day would help the Allies to bring more supplies, more tanks, more artillery, and more soldiers to France. For Germany, the task became more difficult by the hour. The possibility of smashing a landing on the beach became the much more difficult task of pushing in a growing Allied front in Normandy. The German reactions to D-Day therefore show a mixture of toughness, courage on the part of individual soldiers, tactical dangerousness, and strategic failure. The Wehrmacht was by no means defenseless. It could inflict heavy losses and would fight bitterly in Normandy for weeks to come. But on the crucial first day, she lacked the clarity, speed, and agility needed to destroy Overlord. The Allies had not only attacked a coast. They had also attacked the enemy's perception, command channels, and expectations. This invisible part of the war was now working with full force. Thus, June 6, 1944 became a day of missed opportunities for Germany. Not because the victory over the Allies would have been easy, but because the few opportunities that existed were lost in delays, miscalculations, and rigid structures. Hitler's control over reserves, the fixation on Calais, the effect of Allied deception, the air superiority of the enemy, and the disagreement over the correct defense concept combined to create a strategic disadvantage. The Atlantic Wall had not prevented the landing. They had not smashed the reserves in time. And the German leadership had not recognized the decisive moment before it was over. This was precisely one of the deepest truths of Operation Overlord. The Allies won not only because they were stronger, but also because the German side did not understand quickly enough at the decisive moment when the war was changing direction. 12. The Battle for the Beachhead. After June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord was not over. On the contrary, the most difficult part only began now. The Allies had gained a foothold on the beaches of Normandy, but a foot on French soil was not a sure victory. A beachhead is always vulnerable in the first few days after landing. It is cramped, overcrowded, dependent on supplies by sea, and threatened by counterattacks. The soldiers had breached the coastline, but behind them lay beaches full of wrecks, wounded people, vehicles, ammunition boxes, and improvised paths. In front of them lay villages, hedgerows, road crossings, German positions, and a terrain that quickly proved to be much more difficult than many planners had hoped. The decisive question was no longer whether the Allies could land, but whether they could get out of the beaches quickly enough and create a cohesive, resilient space before the Wehrmacht gathered its forces. In the first hours and days after landing, the situation was confusing in many places. The 5 landing zones had to be connected to each other. Utah and Omaha were in the American section, Gold, Juneau, and Sword in the British-Canadian area. There were still gaps between the beaches, German pockets of resistance, and terrain that was not immediately secured. Any delay could be dangerous, because as long as the landing areas remained separate, the Wehrmacht could try to get between them or isolate individual sections. At the same time, the Allies had to bring supplies ashore without interruption. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, radios, spare parts, artillery, tanks, and fresh troops were vital. A soldier can storm a beach, but an army cannot conduct a campaign without supplies. The beaches turned into huge, chaotic unloading zones. Pioneers built paths, cleared mines, marked safe areas, and tried to regulate traffic. Vehicles had to get from the sand to solid roads. The wounded were brought back to assembly points, the dead were recovered, prisoners were taken away. Landing craft came and went, some damaged, some overloaded, some hampered by weather, current, or enemy fire. The artificial harbors, the Mulberry facilities, were soon to help unload larger quantities of material. But even this technical masterpiece had to be built up and asserted against the sea, weather, and damage. It was particularly clear that Overlord was not just a battle, but a logistical race. Every day that more material came ashore made the bridgehead stronger. Every day that German reserves were held up shifted the balance in favor of the Allies. But the Normandy terrain posed serious problems for the attackers. Behind many stretches of coastline began the bocage, a hedgerow landscape that looked more harmless on maps than it was in battle. The fields were surrounded by high, dense hedgerows, often overgrown with earth, roots, and shrubs in such a way that they looked like natural walls to vehicles. Narrow paths, small fields, limited visibility, and countless hiding places made the advance slow and dangerous. This terrain was ideal for German defenders. A machine gun, an anti-tank gun, or a single gunner with a bazooka could work from a short distance and then disappear. 4 Allied tanks, any breakthrough through a hedge became a risk, because a mine, a gun, or a camouflaged enemy could be waiting behind it. The Allied soldiers had to learn to fight in a terrain that left little room for large movements and turned any progress into small, bloody battles. The German Wehrmacht defended itself stubbornly in Normandy. Although she had missed the decisive first counterattack on D-Day, she was by no means beaten. Experienced units, tank formations, paratroopers, Waffen-SS troops, and local defense forces were gradually thrown into battle. They used villages, hedgerows, mountain ranges, and road junctions to slow down the Allied advance. The Germans knew that they had to gain time. If they could keep the Allies in the bridgehead long enough, they might hope to stabilize the situation or at least destroy the Allied schedule. Every day of delay meant more losses, more bottlenecks, and more political pressure for the Allies. For Germany, however, every day also meant a new burden, because Allied air raids smashed transport routes and the pressure on the Eastern Front remained enormous. A special focus was on the Cannes area. The city had already been an important target in the planning of D-Day, but it was not taken on the first day. For the British and Canadians, the battle for Cannes developed into a long, difficult conflict. The city and its surrounding area were militarily important because they connected roads and opened up access to more open terrain south of the city. At the same time, the fighting there attracted strong German tank forces. This had a double effect. On the one hand, the British-Canadian troops made slow progress and suffered heavy losses. On the other hand, they tied up German units that might have been dangerous to the Americans in the West. In the later interpretation, this gave rise to a controversial question. Was the slow progress it can a problem or part of a strategy to keep German tanks in the east of the bridgehead? The truth probably lies between both points of view. The fighting was harder and slower than hoped, but it helped to tie up German forces. The situation was also difficult in the American sector. Especially after securing Omaha and Utah, the Americans had to expand the connection between the landing zones and at the same time advance westwards on the Cotentin Peninsula. There was Cherbourg, a port of great importance. The Allies urgently needed a larger port, because even with beaches and artificial harbors, supplying a growing army remained an enormous challenge. The advance to Cherbourg led through difficult terrain and against German defenses, but the objective was strategically indispensable. When Cherbourg was finally conquered at the end of June, the Germans had severely damaged the port. This showed once again that military capture and practical use were not the same thing. A port on the map was worthless as long as port facilities were destroyed, mines laid and access roads blocked. While the soldiers fought, the civilian population of Normandy suffered severely. Towns and villages were under bombardment, artillery fire and battles. Houses were destroyed, families fled or hid in basements, farms became fighting positions, roads became supply routes. For many French people, liberation did not mean immediate joy, but initially fear, loss, and uncertainty. Allied bombs were intended to hinder German movements, but also hit residential areas. German troops confiscated material, forced people to work, or reacted harshly to actual or suspected acts of resistance. The moral tension of liberation was particularly evident here. The Allies came to liberate France from occupation, but the way there was through the destruction of French towns and through the suffering of people who had hoped for this moment for years. The construction of the bridgehead also required enormous coordination. Roads had to be used for supplies, transport of the wounded and troop movements at the same time. Military police regulated columns, engineers repaired paths, radio operators maintained connections, staffs tried to form a picture of the situation from incomplete reports. Each advance created new demands. If a village was taken, it had to be secured. When a road was opened, it had to be protected from artillery and counterattacks. When tanks advanced, they needed fuel and spare parts. When infantry took up a position, they had to receive ammunition. The war in Normandy was therefore not just a series of attacks, but a constant struggle for order in a space marked by violence, movement, and destruction. Allied air superiority remained a decisive advantage. German troop movements in daylight were dangerous. Columns had to camouflage themselves, march at night, or take detours. Bridges, train stations, and road junctions were attacked again and again. As a result, the German reinforcement of the front area was considerably delayed. But air power alone could not conquer the site. It could weaken, isolate, and demoralize opponents, but in the end, infantry and tanks had to advance through hedges, villages, and fields. It was precisely this combination of overwhelming Allied material power and tenacious German resistance that made Normandy such a costly battle. The Allies were stronger, but not omnipotent. The Germans were strategically defensive, but tactically often dangerous. During these weeks, the psychological situation also changed. On D-Day, many soldiers had only thought about surviving the beach. Now they had to understand that the struggle continued, day by day, field by field, village by village. The hope of a quick breakout gave way to the reality of an arduous struggle. Rain, mud, exhaustion, lack of sleep, artillery fire, and the sight of destroyed landscapes shaped everyday life. For some soldiers, Normandy became a labyrinth of hedges and fear. For others, every little progress was a sign that the enormous effort had not been in vain. Comradeship played a central role. Men often fought less for abstract goals than for the people right next to them. Despite all the difficulties, the Allied bridgehead grew slowly and steadily. The landing zones were connected, supply flows stabilized, artillery and tanks came ashore in larger numbers, airfields were prepared, the wounded were evacuated, and new units were introduced. The Wehrmacht was able to slow down the advance, but it could no longer eliminate the bridgehead. That was the decisive difference to the first hours of June 6th. There had been the possibility of throwing the landing back into the sea. After a few days and weeks, this possibility became more and more unrealistic. The Allied bridgehead became a military reality that expanded and deepened. The battle for the beachhead shows why D-Day alone is not enough to understand Operation Overlord. The landing was the dramatic prelude, but the decision was made by holding, supplying, and expanding the space gained. This was where the real strength of the Allies became apparent, not only in the courage of the first waves, but in the ability to turn a contested coastal strip into a growing front. At the same time, the tragedy of the war was in full force. Liberation meant not only jubilation and flags, but destroyed cities, dead soldiers, orphan families, and a landscape that had become a battlefield. At the end of this phase, the bridgehead was not yet the big breakthrough that many had hoped for. The Allies continued to stand in Normandy, wrestling for Caen, fighting in the bocage and looking for the moment when the narrow front could turn into a war of movement. But the most important thing had been achieved: they had stayed. The German defenses had not regained the coast, the Allied supplies were running, and more forces were coming ashore. The dangerous venture of D-Day had become a fortified starting point for the liberation of France. The bridgehead was bought at a high price, but it held. And as long as it held, the return of the Allies to Europe was no longer just a promise, but an irreversible fact. 13. From landing to breakout. After the first few weeks in Normandy, it became increasingly clear that Operation Overlord would not end in a rapid advance. The Allies had created a solid bridgehead, but they were still trapped in a confined space. The beaches were secured, supplies came ashore in large quantities, and more soldiers, vehicles, guns, and tanks were on French soil. Nevertheless, the war had not immediately turned into the open movement that many planners had hoped for. Instead, the front slowly ate its way through hedgerows, villages, small roads, destroyed farms, and dogged German positions. The dramatic day of the landing had turned into a tough battle in which every kilometer had to be paid dearly. The path from D-Day to the escape from Normandy was therefore not a simple continuation of success, but a second, equally decisive phase of the operation. The Allies were faced with a strategic problem. As long as they were stuck in the Norman bridgehead, they could only play out their material superiority to a limited extent. Their army grew daily, but the available space remained tight. Roads were congested, supply depots crowded near the coast, and every movement had to be carefully coordinated. The Germans had survived the initial shock of the landing and used the terrain to slow down the advance. Especially the bocage in the American section became a nightmare. The dense hedgerows, narrow paths, and small fields destroyed the advantages of fast tank movements. Instead of major breakthroughs, there were a large number of small battles in which infantry, engineers, tanks, and artillery had to work closely together. Any advance through a hedge could lead to an ambush. Any seemingly abandoned courtyard could be covered by snipers, machine guns, or anti-tank weapons. In the British-Canadian sector, the battle continued to focus on Caen and the surrounding area. Caen had already been an important target on D-Day, but the city was not taken immediately. This developed into a protracted and costly battle. For the Allies, Caen was important because important roads converged there, and because south of the city there was more open terrain that was more suitable for tank operations than the hedgerows in the west. For the Germans, the region was just as important because an Allied breakthrough there could endanger the entire front. Therefore, they threw strong tank formations into this room. British and Canadian troops had to fight against experienced German units, including Panzer and Waffen-SS units, which defended themselves fiercely. The Battle of Caen became a symbol of the severity of the Normandy battle: massive firepower, destroyed villages, high casualties, and progress that was often slow to be seen. The destruction of Caen and other Norman sites once again demonstrated the moral tension of liberation. The Allies came to liberate France from German occupation, but their bombings and artillery attacks turned many towns and villages into rubble. For the civilian population, liberation was not a clean transition from darkness to light. It meant cellars, fire, deaths, fear of German retaliation and the constant danger of getting caught between the fronts. In the memory of D-Day, the beaches are often the focus, but for many people in Normandy, the worst suffering only began afterwards. Their homeland became the space where two industrial war machines met. The question of whether a goal can be just and still require terrible means was not theoretically visible here, but in people's everyday lives. Despite the slow progress, the battles for Caen fulfilled an important operational function. They tied up a significant part of the German tank forces in the east of the bridgehead. This bond was of great importance to Americans in the West. There, the U.S. Army prepared for the decisive breakout. But before this was possible, the western flank had to be secured and Cherbourg conquered. The port of Cherbourg on the Cotentin Peninsula was of great importance for Allied logistics. The artificial harbors and beach dumps did an amazing job, but in the long term, a growing army needed deeper, more efficient port facilities. The Germans defended Cherbourg, eventually withdrew and destroyed the port facilities so thoroughly that the Allies had to laboriously make them usable again. Nevertheless, the capture of the city was an important step because it secured the western part of the bridgehead and created the basis for further operations. The actual outbreak was prepared under the name Operation Cobra. The idea was to break through the German front in the American sector near St. Lo by massive air raids and concentrated ground troops. St. Lo itself had been badly destroyed by the fighting and was later referred to as the capital of the ruins. The city was located in an area that was of great importance for the further advance. The Americans wanted to shake the German defenses so badly at one point that tanks and mobile units could then advance into the more open terrain. Unlike in the Bocage, the war was then to become more mobile again. So Cobra was more than a local attack. It was an attempt to break open the whole rigid Normandy front. The preparation of this operation once again demonstrated the power, but also the risks of Allied firepower. A massive bombing raid was intended to smash the German lines, demoralize defenders, and create the conditions for the ground advance. But such operations were difficult to control. The bombings also resulted in tragic hits on its own troops. This made clear how dangerous modern coordinated warfare was, even for the side that had air superiority. Nevertheless, the effect on the German defense was considerable. Many positions were destroyed or paralyzed, communications broke down, units were shaken, and the American ground forces were given the opportunity to break into the front. When Operation Cobra started at the end of July 1944, the situation began to change fundamentally. At first, progress was still difficult, because even shaken German associations were able to resist. But then the breakthrough came. American tanks and motorized units pushed out of the narrow Norman terrain. The war, which had been characterized by hedges, small fields, and slow infantry battles for weeks, suddenly gained speed. The German front in the west began to tear. What had previously been a tough fight for every meter turned into a movement that the Wehrmacht found increasingly difficult to control. The outbreak showed why the Allies had held on to the bridgehead so stubbornly. As soon as sufficient forces had been gathered and the German front had been broken in the right place, the material and motorized superiority of the Allies could take full effect. On the German side, the crisis quickly worsened. The Wehrmacht had suffered heavy losses in Normandy. Many units had bled dry, vehicles were missing, fuel was scarce, and Allied air superiority made movements dangerous. Nevertheless, Hitler demanded counterattacks, which often corresponded more to his will to control than to the military situation. In particular, the German counterattack at Mortain in August was intended to cut off the American breakthrough and restore the situation. But this attack failed. The German forces were too weak, the Allied reactions too fast, and the air superiority of the Western Allies too overwhelming. Instead of stopping the breakthrough, the failed counterattack helped to further exhaust German units and put them in a dangerous position. The next decisive phase was the development of encirclement in the Falaise area. While American troops advanced from the west and south and British-Canadian forces pushed from the north and northeast, large sections of the German forces in Normandy were in danger of being encircled. The so-called Falaise Bag became one of the most dramatic moments of the Battle of Normandy. German units tried to escape under constant pressure, air raids, and artillery fire. Roads were clogged with vehicles, horses, guns, wounded and fleeing soldiers. The losses were heavy, and although not all German forces were included, the Wehrmacht suffered a devastating defeat. Their ability to defend France coherently west of the Seine was decisively weakened. With the eruption of Normandy, the political and psychological significance of Overlord also changed. Until then, the question had been whether the Allies could maintain and expand their bridgehead. Now it became apparent that the German occupation in France could no longer be maintained permanently. The advance gained speed. Cities and villages were liberated, German units withdrew, resistance groups came forward more openly, and the hope for the liberation of Paris became tangible. But this advance also brought new problems. The faster the Allies advanced, the longer their supply routes became. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts and food had to be brought over the beaches and damaged ports. Speed created new dependencies. The war was not over just because the front was moving. The path from D-Day to outbreak shows that Operation Overlord cannot be reduced to a single day. June 6th was the beginning, but the decision was made in the weeks that followed, when the Allies defended, expanded, and finally broke out of their bridgehead. The Battle of Normandy was a battle of patience, logistics, firepower, and nerves. The Allies had to endure setbacks, achieve goals later than planned, and accept high losses. The Germans had to realize that tactical tenacity alone was not enough if the enemy had superior air power, supply power, and growing operational mobility. In the end, the landing turned into a strategic avalanche. Not immediately, not effortlessly, and not without terrible costs, but step by step. The beaches of Normandy had given the Allies access. The bridgehead had given them space. The outbreak gave them movement. This marked the beginning of the liberation of France in a new phase. The Wehrmacht had not been destroyed in the West, but it was badly battered and had to retreat on a broad front. Operation Overlord had achieved its goal. The Western Allies had not only landed, they had created a front from which the way to Paris, the Seine, and finally to Germany was opened. Normandy was thus not only the place of return to Europe, but the space in which the military collapse of German rule in the West began out of hope, planning, and sacrifice. 14. The political significance of the invasion. Operation Overlord was much more than a military landing on the Normandy coast. June 6, 1944, and the fighting that followed changed not only the front lines in France, but also the political balance of Europe. With the return of the Western Allies to the continent, it became clear that the liberation of Europe would not be achieved by the Red Army from the East alone. The United States, Great Britain, Canada, and their allies created a second major front in the West, which put military pressure on the German Reich and at the same time raised the question of what Europe should look like after the war. Every road, every port, every liberated city, and every advance towards Paris therefore had a double meaning. It was about military space, but also about political influence, national dignity, alliance power, and the future order of a destroyed continent. Even before the landing, the invasion had become politically inevitable. Since the German attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin had repeatedly called for a second front in the West. For the Soviet Union, this demand was not just diplomatic pressure, but an expression of an existential situation. The Red Army bore the brunt of the land war against Germany. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians died, cities were destroyed, entire regions were devastated. From Moscow's point of view, the Western Allies finally had to land in France in order to tie up German forces and relieve the Soviet front. Every postponement fueled Stalin's suspicion that London and Washington wanted to let the Soviet Union bleed dry against Germany for as long as possible. This view was characterized by mistrust, but it was based on the actual enormous burden of sacrifice of the East. For Roosevelt and Churchill, the question was more complicated. Both knew that a poorly prepared landing in France could end in disaster. Failure would not only have had military consequences, but would also have shaken trust between the Allies, strengthened Hitler's regime in terms of propaganda and possibly delayed the liberation of Europe for years. For this reason, the Western Allies had initially fought in North Africa, Sicily and Italy, gained experience and incriminated Germany in several places. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that a direct attack on Western Europe was necessary. Without a strong Western front, the Red Army might have liberated a much larger part of Europe on its own in the end, and thus also shaped it politically. Overlord was therefore not only a response to Hitler's occupation, but also a signal to Stalin. The Western powers were ready to enter the continent with their own armies and help shape the post-war order. France was at the center of this political importance. Since 1940, the country had been occupied, humiliated, and internally divided. The Vichy regime had collaborated with Germany, while Charles de Gaulle claimed to represent the true, free France from London and later from Algiers. For de Gaulle, the Allied landings were an opportunity, but also a danger. He wanted to prevent France from being treated like a defeated or administered territory after liberation. His goal was the restoration of French sovereignty. France was not only to be liberated, but to reappear as a nation, with its own government, its own voice and its own dignity. This led to tensions with Roosevelt, who distrusted de Gaulle for a long time and considered him difficult to predict. But de Gaulle understood something that military planners sometimes underestimated. Liberation is not only a question of armies, but also of political legitimacy. The population of France experienced this tension directly. Many people had hoped for the return of the Allies for years, but the liberation initially brought destruction, bombing, fighting, and insecurity. Cities such as Caen, Saint-Lô, and many smaller towns in Normandy were hit hard. People died as a result of Allied bombs, German retaliation, artillery fire, and the fighting between the fronts. Politically, this was a bitter truth. The Allies came as liberators, but their liberation was inseparable from military force. It was therefore important for de Gaulle and the French resistance not to make the liberation appear as a purely foreign operation. French resistance fighters sabotaged railways, attacked German connections, collected information, and supported the advance. Their participation strengthened the claim that France itself had participated in its liberation. With the advance from Normandy, Paris also became the center of attention. The city had enormous symbolic significance. Paris was not only a capital, but a symbol of European culture, French statehood, and political identity. For Hitler and the German occupation, Paris had been an object of prestige. For the Allies and for de Gaulle, his liberation was a decisive moment. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, it was not the end of the war militarily, but politically it was an event of the greatest impact. De Gaulle moved into the city and embodied the claim that the Republic returned. This prevented a dangerous political vacuum from arising after the withdrawal of the Germans. The liberation of Paris made it clear that France was not only the object of Allied strategy, but wanted to become the subject of European politics again. Overlord also had a special significance for Great Britain. Since 1940, the country had stood up to Hitler in Western Europe alone, survived the air battle, waged the Atlantic War, and served as a base for the later attack. The invasion confirmed the British will to persevere and the strategic importance of the island. At the same time, however, Overlord also showed that the balance of power within the Western Alliance had shifted. The United States provided ever greater quantities of material, troops, ships, and economic power. Britain remained a key partner, but it was no longer the dominant world power of earlier times. The operation revealed the transition to a post-war world in which Washington would take a leading role. Churchill felt this change exactly. His country was victorious, but exhausted. The victory over Germany would not return Britain to its old imperial strength. For the United States, Overlord was a decisive step in its role as a global power of order. American soldiers no longer fought only in a distant European war, but actively helped to determine the future of the continent. Roosevelt was already thinking of a post-war order in which international cooperation, economic stabilization, and collective security would play a central role. The war was not simply to end with a military victory, but to create a new structure that would prevent future catastrophes. At the same time, the American presence in Europe meant a permanent shift in power. The US was no longer just a supporter, but a decisive player. Overlord made this reality visible. For Germany, the landing had a devastating political effect. Hitler's regime had claimed that the Atlantic Wall would protect Europe against any invasion. The successful landing destroyed this image. Although the propaganda initially tried to downplay the events or portray them as a temporary crisis, the reality could not be hidden. Germany now had to fight on three major fronts: in the east against the Soviet Union, in Italy against Allied forces, and in France against the Western Allies. In addition, there was the air war over German cities, partisan fighting in occupied territories, and growing economic exhaustion. Overlord showed the German leadership and many Germans that the war had finally entered a phase in which victory was hardly conceivable. Nevertheless, Hitler persisted in continuing the struggle, which only prolonged the suffering. The invasion also had an impact on the occupied countries of Europe. In Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and other countries, the hope of liberation became more tangible. Resistance movements saw that German rule in the West was not unshakable. At the same time, they had to remain cautious, because German security forces often reacted brutally to sabotage and uprisings. Overlord gave these movements a moral boost, but it also exposed them to new dangers. The liberation of Europe was not a unified process. It took a different course depending on the country, military situation, and political structure. But Normandy showed that the German occupation order in the West had begun to falter. Another key political point was the emerging division of Europe into zones of influence. While the Western Allies advanced eastwards from France, the Red Army advanced from east to west. Both movements were aimed at the defeat of Germany, but they already bore the outlines of the coming Cold War. Where an army liberated, it often gained political influence. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union increasingly imposed governments and structures that corresponded to its interests. In Western Europe, the USA and Great Britain supported the reconstruction of democratic systems, but also within the framework of their strategic interests. Operation Overlord was therefore a decisive reason why Western Europe did not fall under Soviet control after the war. The Normandy landings were thus also an event that helped shape the later political map of Europe. However, this political significance must not lead to viewing the invasion only as a power game of the large states. For millions of people, it meant the concrete prospect of an end to occupation, coercion, persecution, and war. For Jewish survivors, forced laborers, political prisoners, resistance fighters, and persecuted minorities, any Allied advance could mean lives, even if the liberation of many camps and occupied territories was still months away. At the same time, Overlord came too late for countless victims. The National Socialist policy of extermination had already caused immeasurable suffering. This fact gives the invasion a moral urgency, but also a tragic gravity. It was a necessary step against a murderous regime, but it could not undo what had already happened. Operation Overlord thus became a turning point that combined military, political, and moral dimensions. Militarily, it opened the Western Front in France. Politically, it demonstrated the Western Alliance's ability to act. Diplomatically, it strengthened the position of the USA and Great Britain vis-a-vis Stalin. For France, it enabled the return of national sovereignty. For Germany, it meant the beginning of an unstoppable strategic overload. For Europe as a whole, it became a step on the way to a new order that would be characterized by liberation, occupation, division, reconstruction, and systemic conflict after 1945. In the end, the political significance of Overlord lay precisely in this complexity. The landing was not only an attack on beaches, but an attack on German rule over Western Europe. It was not just a military operation, but a message to allies, opponents, and occupied peoples. It showed Stalin that the Western Allies were back. It showed France that liberation was possible. It showed Germany that the war was now in danger of being lost in the West as well. And it showed the world that the outcome of World War II was decided not only on the battlefield, but also on the question of who would create political order after victory. Operation Overlord opened the way to France, but at the same time it opened the way to the post-war period. 15. Myth, memory and legacy of Overlord. Operation Overlord is one of those events in world history that has gained significance far beyond its military course. D-Day is not just a date in the chronologies of World War II, but a symbol. It stands for courage, sacrifice, liberation, and the common struggle against National Socialist rule. But precisely because this day is so strongly remembered, it is important not to turn it into a simple heroic image. The Normandy landings were a huge military undertaking, but it was at the same time a human drama, a political turning point, and a morally difficult event. Their legacy consists not only of triumph, but also of suffering, destruction, fear, and the difficult question of what price freedom can have in an all-out war. Immediately after June 6, 1944, the interpretation of this day began. For the Allies, the successful landing was a powerful signal. After years of German occupation in Western Europe, after defeats, retreats, and long preparations, American, British, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers had re-entered the continent. The images of landing craft, paratroopers, warships, and soldiers on the beaches quickly became symbols of a huge liberation effort. Especially in the United States, Great Britain, and Canada, D-Day took a firm place in national memory. It was associated with the courage of a generation that was ready to fight against a murderous regime. For many families, however, this memory was never abstract. It bore names, faces, letters, photos, and graves. In France, the memory of Overlord was even more complex. On the one hand, the landing marked the beginning of liberation from German occupation in the West. For many people, it was a moment they had hoped for since 1940. The German flags, the occupying soldiers, the fear of raids, forced labor, repression, and collaboration should finally disappear. On the other hand, liberation came through war. Norman towns and villages were severely destroyed, thousands of civilians died, families lost their homes, their loved ones, and their familiar surroundings. Those who lived in Caen, Saint-Lô, or one of the many smaller towns remembered not only Allied soldiers as liberators, but also nights of bombing, artillery fire, rubble, and escape. This makes French memory particularly deep. It contains gratitude, but also pain. She knows that liberation was necessary, but she does not forget that it came through violence. The myth of D-Day has grown stronger and stronger over the decades. Films, books, documentaries, museums, and commemorations shaped the image of a heroic landing against Hitler's Fortress Europe. Omaha Beach in particular became a central place of remembrance. The beach stands for sacrifice and perseverance, for men who got out of the boats under terrible fire and continued to fight despite chaos, fear, and death. This memory is justified, but it can also be narrowing. If you only see Omaha, it is easy to overlook the other beaches, the airborne troops, the sailors, the pioneers, the Canadian victims at Juno, the British battles at Golden Sword, the French resistance, and the civilian population of Normandy. Overlord was not a single image, but a mosaic of countless experiences. The role of the Soviet Union also belongs to this larger picture. D-Day was undoubtedly a decisive moment on the Western Front, but the war against Germany was decided on several fronts. The Red Army had tied up most of the German land forces since 1941 and made enormous sacrifices. Without the battles in the East, without Stalingrad, Kursk, and the incessant Soviet pressure, the situation for the Western Allies in 1944 would have been far more difficult. This does not diminish the courage of the soldiers in Normandy. It classifies him. The victory over Nazi Germany was the result of a common, albeit tense, struggle of very different allies. The legacy of Overlord must therefore not lead to the idea that the war was decided solely on the beaches of France. Rather, Normandy was a decisive part of a global struggle. At the same time, Overlord shows how much modern wars depend on planning, industry, and logistics. In memory, The men who got out of the landing craft are often in the foreground. But behind them were shipyards, factories, ports, railways, engineers, radio operators, meteorologists, secret services, and millions of workers. D-Day was also a victory for the organization. The Allies could build ships, supply fuel, develop artificial harbors, establish air superiority, coordinate deception operations, and bring vast quantities of material across the sea. The lone soldier fought on the beach, but he was supported by a huge structure. This makes Operation Overlord an example of how wars of the 20th century were decided not only by bravery, but by industrial, scientific, and administrative efficiency. But this is precisely where moral ambivalence lies. The same industrial force that made liberation possible produced destruction on a scale that previous generations would hardly have known. Cities were bombed, landscapes devastated, people were moved, wounded, or killed en masse. Modern warfare can defeat a criminal regime, but it remains itself a machine of violence. D-Day therefore not only reminds us that freedom must be defended, he also reminds us that the price of an injustice stopped too late can be enormous. If Hitler's Germany could have been stopped earlier, millions of people might have been spared. But by the time the world finally acted, the war had escalated to the point where liberation was only possible through a massive military effort. For the veterans themselves, the legacy was often quieter, more personal and heavier than the public commemorative speeches. For decades, many hardly spoke about what they had experienced. Others visited the beaches and cemeteries, looked for the names of fallen comrades, or stood silently in front of the rows of white crosses and stars. The distance between official remembrance and personal remembrance could be large. A nation speaks of victory. A veteran remembers a friend who fell next to him. A monument speaks of a willingness to make sacrifices. A family remembers a letter that was never answered. It is precisely these personal memories that prevent D-Day from becoming a mere legend. They state that history is not made by abstract forces alone, but by people with fear, hope, pain, and responsibility. Operation Overlord is also important for Germany. It marked the beginning of the final military defeat in the West and showed that Hitler's rule over Europe could not last. In German memory, D-Day has long been less of a focus than Stalingrad, the bombing war, flight and expulsion, or the end of the war in 1945. But it is also part of German history because it ushered in liberation from a regime that had led Europe and Germany itself into the abyss. This liberation came from without, because the inner strength had not been sufficient to overthrow Hitler. This is a painful but important realization. Overlord reminds us that dictatorships destroy not only their victims, but also the societies in whose name they claim to act. To this day, the beaches of Normandy are places of remembrance. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword are no longer ordinary stretches of coastline. They are landscapes of memory. Cemeteries, museums, bunker remains, monuments, and preserved traces in the area make it visible that world history took place here. Visitors today see calm seas, wide skies, and peaceful places. It is precisely this contrast that makes the memory so strong. Where families walk today, wounded people once lay in the sand. Where grass grows over former positions today, life and death were decided back then. The peaceful present is part of the legacy. It shows what was at stake and what was won. The legacy of Operation Overlord, therefore, does not lie in a simple message. It's not just about bravery, not just about military planning, not just about the victory of the Allies. It is about the fragility of freedom, the consequences of political radicalization, the need for international cooperation, and the responsibility to honestly preserve historical memory. Overlord shows that democracies can be slow, contradictory, and strife, but are still able to act together against a murderous dictatorship. It also shows that political decisions have concrete human costs, and that every military success remains linked to the fates of those who fought for it or suffered from it. In the end, D-Day remains a day on which hope and terror were inextricably linked. For the occupied countries of Western Europe, a path to freedom began. For many soldiers, their personal struggle began or ended that morning. For the German occupying regime, the collapse began in the West. A foundation was laid for the post-war order of Europe that had an impact far beyond 1944. The myth of Overlord lives on because it tells of courage. But its truth is greater than the myth. It tells of planning and chance, of power and morality, of liberation and destruction, of great strategies and individual people. This is precisely the lasting significance of this operation. It reminds us that freedom can never be taken for granted, and that history speaks most forcefully where triumph and mourning stand side by side.